This is Audible.
Lion Crest Publishing presents Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Read by David Goggins and Adam Skolnick.
Life isn't fair. It's not supposed to be. Life is not biased to anyone. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, gay or lesbian, rich or poor. Life doesn't discriminate. Once you accept the fact that life is going to fuck you up in one way or another, you can start preparing for it. The right mindset is everything. It'll be the only thing that will get you through life. Having a can't hurt me mentality will always keep you in the fight. You have to be open-minded enough to believe that whatever life throws at you, you can overcome. What I'm about to do is very uncomfortable for me. I'm used to sharing my story on a very surface level, but for the last 8 months, I drilled deep in my life with Adam, my ghostwriter. I was forced to go back to the sewer where I once lived in my mind. To be honest, writing this book was one of the hardest things I've ever done mentally. Being completely vulnerable and exposed are some of the hardest things a person can ever do. We all have a story. You are all about to hear mine. Life isn't always fun, so how I talk about my life is raw, real, and authentic. I was the ultimate underdog. I was the weakest one of the litter. Knowing that, I had to figure out a way to survive and ultimately thrive. Back then, there was no talk about mental toughness. That shit didn't even exist. You just had to figure shit out. I realized at a very young age, I was fucked. And I had a very long and hard road to hoe without any tools. I wanted to give up more times than I could count, but that voice in my head wouldn't allow me. Being at a disadvantage forced me to create an indestructible mental toolbox, one I couldn't get from theory. It would have to come from practice and repetition. I had no peace in my life because I was living a lie. I didn't want people to know the real me. No one wants to tell people they are insecure and afraid. I realized for me to find peace, I'd have to face my fucked up life and fix it alone. No one was coming to save me. I didn't want money, fame, or awards, or even a pat on the fucking back. I was looking for self-fulfillment. I was looking for it everywhere. I realized I couldn't find it from an outside source. It would have to come from within. And to find it, I'd have to be willing to go to war with myself. One thing I figured out along my journey is that you have to believe you are here for a reason, not just floating around willy-nilly. I believe the reason I was put here was to unlock the code to human potential, to tell the world you can be born in a fucking sewer and still be the baddest motherfucker on earth. Just remember one thing. Once you climb out of the sewer and are standing on the road, look around and take pride in the fact that nothing can hurt you.
Man, I cannot wait to get into this right now, man. I'm so happy to be here.
It's been a long time coming, Adam. We've put a lot of hours behind this. About what, 8 months?
Yeah, at least. I think we first contacted, about almost a year ago now.
Well, I'm excited, man. What we're about to do is something I don't believe has ever been done before in the audiobook world. We're going to do an audiobook / podcast / radio show. So we'll see how it turns out.
Project /. And so my name's Adam Skolnick. I helped David get this book on paper. It's been a labor of love, but it's also been really challenged because this life, to be able to put this life in stark relief for everyone to see and understand and absorb, it's not an easy process for you.
No, not at all. It was the hardest thing I've done, like I said, mentally in my entire life. To have to drill down deep in my life and go straight from the surface and go way deep to the sewer where I once lived. You don't want to go back there. Once you kind of go back and figure it out and overcome things, I didn't want to revisit that place. And doing this book made me, revisit it. And also now I'm telling people my life, people I don't even know. So that's even harder.
And you asked me to read this because you wanted to universalize your story, because this is not about, hero worship for David Goggins. This is about something else, right?
No, this isn't about me. And I'm not the hero here. You are the hero. So that's why I'm not reading this book. This book, yes, this is my life. But once again, I'm not the hero. The hero is you.
So we're going to get into it now. There's 11 chapters in this book, and in between are 10 challenges. The principles that David outlines in his book are then encapsulated in these challenges for you listeners to be able to apply them to your life. And that's the whole point of this book. Like we were just saying, it's all about creating a toolbox for you listeners to then apply to your life. And the motivation will, of course, come from David's amazing life story. Anything else you want to say to prep these guys for what's about to happen?
Yes, like I said in my small and brief introduction was, basically this is about a habit. There was no mental toughness class when I was growing up. I had to figure out an indestructible toolbox to get through my life. And what I figured out along the way is your mind has the tactical advantage over you. And that's what I'm trying to fix here for everybody listening to this. Your mind has a tactical advantage. So what do I mean there? What I mean is your mind knows your insecurities. It knows your fears. And your mind can only process so much. And all that stuff that it takes a long time to process, it starts to filter out. So what that means is pain, insecurities, fear, it wants to get rid of it. It doesn't want to face it. That's a challenge that the mind has no time for. So these tools are going to teach you to start facing your fears, start tripling down on your insecurities, tripling down on your fears, tripling down on your weaknesses, tripling down on being uncomfortable. And that's where you start becoming just mentally tough. That's where it happens.
And it comes from ownership of your life completely.
And that's exactly what I'm doing here. And that is the hardest part about my story, Adam, is for me to set the example, I have to put all of my shit out there for everyone to see. I have to own my life. Situation. You are in danger of living a life so comfortable and soft that you will die without ever realizing your true potential. Mission. To unshackle your mind. Ditch your victim's mentality forever. Own all aspects of your life completely. Build an unbreakable foundation. Execution. Read this cover to cover. Study the techniques within. Accept all 10 challenges. Repeat. Repetition will callous your mind. If you do your job to the best of your ability, this will hurt. This mission is not about making yourself feel better. This mission is about being better and having a greater impact on the world. Don't stop when you're tired. Stop when you're done. Classified. This is an origin story of a hero. The hero is you.
Introduction. Do you know who you really are and what you're capable of? I'm sure you think so, but just because you believe something doesn't make it true. Denial is the ultimate comfort zone. Don't worry, you aren't alone. In every town, in every country, all over the world, millions roam the streets, dead-eyed as zombies, addicted to comfort, embracing a victim's mentality, and unaware of their true potential. I know this because I meet and hear from them all the time, and because just like you, I used to be one of them. I had a damn good excuse too. Life dealt me a bad hand. I was born broken, grew up with beatdowns, was tormented in school, and called nigger more times than I can count. We were once poor, surviving on welfare, living in government-subsidized housing, and my depression was smothering. I lived life at the bottom of the barrel, and my future forecast was bleak as fuck. Very few people know how the bottom feels, but I do. It's like quicksand. It grabs you, sucks you under, and won't let go. When life is like that, it's easy to drift and continue to make the same comfortable choices that are killing you, over and over again. But the truth is, we all make habitual, self-limiting choices. It's as natural as a sunset, and as fundamental as gravity. It's how our brains are wired, which is why motivation is crap. Even the best pep talk or self-help hack is nothing but a temporary fix. It won't rewire your brain. It won't amplify your voice or uplift your life. Motivation changes exactly nobody. The bad hand that was my life was mine, and mine alone to fix. So I sought out pain, fell in love with suffering, and eventually transformed myself from the weakest piece of shit on the planet into the hardest man God ever created. Or so I tell myself. Odds are you have had a much better childhood than I did, and even now might have a damn decent life. But no matter who you are, who your parents are or were, where you live, what you do for a living, or how much money you have, you're probably living at about 40% of your true capability. Damn shame. We all have the potential to be so much more. Years ago, I was invited to be on a panel at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'd never set foot in a university lecture hall as a student. I'd barely graduated high school. Yet I was at one of the most prestigious institutions in the country to discuss mental toughness with a handful of others. At some point in the discussion, an esteemed MIT professor said that we each have genetic limitations, hard ceilings, that there are some things we just can't do, no matter how mentally tough we are. When we hit our genetic ceiling, he said, mental toughness doesn't enter into the equation. Everyone in that room seemed to accept his version of reality because this senior, tenured professor was known for researching mental toughness. It was his life's work. It was also a bunch of bullshit. And to me, he was using science to let us all off the hook. I'd been quiet until then because I was surrounded by all these smart people feeling stupid. But someone in the audience noticed the look on my face and asked if I agreed. And if you ask me a direct question, I won't be shy. There's something to be said for living it instead of studying it, I said, then turned toward the professor. What you said is true for most people, but not 100%. There will always be the 1% of us who are willing to put in the work, to defy the odds. I went on to explain what I knew from experience, that anybody can become a totally different person and achieve what so-called experts like him claim is impossible. But it takes a lot of heart, will, and an armored mind. Heraclitus, a philosopher born in the Persian Empire back in the 5th century BC, had it right when he wrote about men on the battlefield. Out of every 100 men, he wrote, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. Ah, but the one is a warrior. From the time you take your first breath, you become eligible to die. You also become eligible to find your greatness and become the one warrior. But it is up to you to equip yourself for the battle ahead. Only you can master your mind, which is what it takes to live a bold life filled with accomplishments most people consider beyond their capability. I am not a genius like those professors at MIT, but I am that one warrior. And the story you are about to hear, the story of my fucked up life, will illuminate a proven path to self-mastery and empower you to face reality, hold yourself accountable, push past pain, learn to love what you fear, relish failure, live to your fullest potential, and find out who you really are. Human beings change through study, habit, and stories. Through my story, you will learn what the body and mind are capable of when they're driven to maximum capacity and how to get there. Because when you're driven, whatever's in front of you, whether it's racism, sexism, injuries, divorce, depression, obesity, tragedy, or poverty, becomes fuel for your metamorphosis. The steps laid out here amount to the evolutionary algorithm, one that obliterates barriers, glimmers with glory, and delivers lasting peace. I hope you're ready. It's time to go to war with yourself. Anything to add here, David?
I hope this story doesn't motivate you. I know a lot of you are thinking, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Motivation is crap. Why do I say that? It comes and it goes. You're very motivated on those days when your life is perfect, when the sun is out, when the bills are paid, when the wife or husband, everything's in its right place. That's when most of us are nice and motivated. So it comes and goes. Let's say right now you read this book and you find motivation from this book, and you're living in Chicago. Let's say it's December in Chicago. Chicago in December time is real cold, and you're motivated to go out for a 2-mile run. You open that door and that wind chill hits your face. If you're motivated, you're going to shut that door and go back and sit down on that couch and watch TV. Those people who find more than motivation from this, maybe a little drive, or maybe even a little obsession to change their life. When they open that door and that wind chill hits their face, they're going to close it just to go back to their closet and put warm clothes on so they can go back out there and tackle whatever's in front of them. When you're driven and obsessed, you no longer care what's in front of you. If your bills aren't paid because you can't figure out a way to do it, if your life isn't perfect, it doesn't matter. You realize that's just life. It's not going to be perfect, but that's not going to derail me from what I have to do to get better.
Chapter 1. I should have been a statistic. We found hell in a beautiful neighborhood. In 1981, Williamsville offered the tastiest real estate in Buffalo, New York. Leafy and friendly, its safe streets were dotted with dainty homes filled with model citizens. Doctors, attorneys, steel plant executives, dentists, and professional football players lived there, with their adoring wives and their 2.2 kids. Cars were new, roads swept, possibilities endless. We're talking about a living, breathing American dream. Hell was a corner lot on Paradise Road. That's where we lived, in a 2-story, 4-bedroom, white wooden home with 4 square pillars framing a front porch that led to the widest, greenest lawn in Williamsville. We had a vegetable garden out back and a 2-car garage stocked with a 1962 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, a 1980 Mercedes 450 SLC, and in the driveway was a sparkling new 1981 black Corvette. Everyone on Paradise Road lived near the top of the food chain, and based on appearances, most of our neighbors thought that we, the so-called happy, well-adjusted Goggins family, were the tip of that spear. But glossy surfaces reflect much more than they reveal. They'd see us most weekday mornings gathered in the driveway at 7 a.m. My dad, Trunus Goggins, wasn't tall, but he was handsome and built like a boxer. He wore tailored suits, his smile warm and open. He looked every bit the successful businessman on his way to work. My mother, Jackie, was 17 years younger, slender and beautiful, and my brother and I were clean-cut, well-dressed in jeans and pastel Izod shirts, and strapped with backpacks just like the other kids, the white kids. In our version of affluent America, each driveway was a staging ground for nods and waves before parents and children rode off to work and school. Neighbors saw what they wanted. Nobody probed too deep. Good thing. The truth was the Goggins family had just returned home from another all-nighter in the hood. And if Paradise Road was hell, that meant I lived with the devil himself. As soon as our neighbor shut the door or turned the corner, my father's smile morphed into a scowl. He barked orders and went inside to sleep another one off, but our work wasn't done. My brother, Trunus Jr., and I had somewhere to be, and it was up to our sleepless mother to get us there. I was in first grade in 1981, and I was in a school daze for real. Not because the academics were hard, at least not yet, but because I couldn't stay awake. The teacher's sing-song voice was my lullaby, my crossed arms on my desk a comfy pillow, and her sharp words, once she caught me dreaming, an unwelcome alarm clock that wouldn't stop blaring. Children that young are infinite sponges. They soak up language and ideas at warp speed to establish a fundamental foundation upon which most people build lifelong skills, like reading and spelling and basic math. But because I worked nights, I couldn't concentrate on anything most mornings, except trying to stay awake. Recess and PE were a whole different minefield. Out on the playground, staying lucid was the easy part. The hard part was the hiding. Couldn't let my shirt slip. Couldn't wear shorts. Bruises were red flags I couldn't show because if I did, I knew I'd catch even more. Still, on that playground and in the classroom, I knew I was safe. For a little while, at least. It was the one place he couldn't reach me. At least not physically. My brother went through a similar dance in 6th grade. His first year in middle school. He had his own wounds to hide and sleep to harvest, because once that bell rang, real life began. The ride from Williamsville to the Maston district in East Buffalo took about a half an hour, but it may as well have been a world away. Like much of East Buffalo, Maston was a mostly black working-class neighborhood in the inner city that was rough around the edges. Though, in the early 1980s, it was not yet completely ghetto as fuck. Back then, the Bethlehem steel plant was still humming, and Buffalo was the last great American steel town. Most men in the city, black and white, worked solid union jobs and earned a living wage, which meant business in Maston was good. For my dad, it always had been. By the time he was 20 years old, he owned a Coca-Cola distribution concession and 4 delivery routes in the Buffalo area. That's good money for a kid, but he had bigger dreams and an eye on the future. His future had 4 wheels and a disco-funk soundtrack. When a local bakery shut down, he leased the building and built one of Buffalo's first roller skating rinks. Fast forward 10 years, and Skateland had been relocated to a building on Ferry Street that stretched nearly a full block in the heart of the Maston district. He opened a bar above the rink, which he named the Vermilion Room. In the 1970s, that was the place to be in East Buffalo, and it's where he met my mother when she was just 19 and he was 36. It was her first time away from home. Jackie grew up in the Catholic Church. Trunis was the son of a minister and knew her language well enough to masquerade as a believer, which appealed to her. But let's keep it real. She was just as drunk on his charm. Trunis Jr. was born in 1971. I was born in 1975, and by the time I was 6 years old, the roller disco craze was at its absolute peak. Skateland rocked every night. We usually get there around 5 p.m., and while my brother worked the concession stand, popping corn, grilling hot dogs, loading the cooler, and making pizzas, I organized the skates by size and style. Each afternoon I stood on a step stool to spray my stock with aerosol deodorizer and replace the rubber stoppers. That aerosol stink would cloud all around my head and live in my nostrils. My eyes looked permanently bloodshot. It was the only thing I could smell for hours. But those were the distractions I had to ignore to stay organized and on hustle. Because my dad, who worked the DJ booth, was always watching. And if any of those skates went missing, it meant my ass. Before the doors opened, I'd polish the skate rink floor with a dust mop that was twice my size. At around 6 p.m., my mother called us to dinner in the back office. That woman lived in a permanent state of denial. But her maternal instinct was real, and it made a big fucking show of itself, grasping for any shred of normalcy. Every night in that office, she'd set out 2 electric burners on the floor, sit with her legs curled behind her, and prepare a full dinner. Roast meat, potatoes, green beans, and dinner rolls, while my dad did the books and made calls. The food was good, but even at 6 and 7 years old, I knew our family dinner was a bullshit facsimile compared to what most families had. Plus, we ate fast. There was no time to enjoy it because at 7 p.m., when the doors opened, it was showtime, and we all had to be in our places with our stations prepped. My dad was the sheriff, and once he stepped into the DJ booth, he had us triangulated. He scanned that room like an all-seeing eye, and if you fucked up, you'd hear about it, unless you felt it first. The room didn't look like much under the harsh overhead house lights, but once he dimmed them, the show lights bathed the rink in red and glanced off the spinning mirror ball, conjuring a skate disco fantasy. Weekend or weeknight, hundreds of skaters piled through that door. Most of the time they came in as a family, paying their $3 entrance fee and $half skate fee before hitting the floor. I rented out the skates and managed that entire station by myself. I carried that step stool around like a crutch. Without it, the customers couldn't even see me. The bigger size skates were down below the counter, but the smaller sizes were stored so high I'd have to scale the shelves, which always made the customers laugh. Mom was the one and only cashier. She collected everyone's cover charge, and to Trunis, money was everything. He counted the people as they came in, calculating his take in real time, so he had a rough idea of what to expect when he counted out the register after we closed up, and it had better all be there. All the money was his. The rest of us never earned a cent for our sweat. In fact, my mother was never given any money of her own. She had no bank account or credit cards in her name. He controlled everything, and we all knew what would happen if her cash drawer ever came up short. None of the customers who came through our doors knew any of this, of course. To them, Skateland was a family-owned and operated dream cloud. My dad spun the fading vinyl echoes of disco and funk and the early rumbles of hip-hop. Bass bounced off the red walls, courtesy of Buffalo's favorite son, Rick James, George Clinton's Funkadelic, and the first tracks ever released by hip-hop innovators Run DMC. Some of the kids were speed skating. I liked to go fast too, but we had our share of skate dancers, and that floor got funky. For the first hour or two, the parents stayed downstairs and skated, or watched their kids spin the oval. But they would eventually leak upstairs to make their own scene, and when enough of them made their move, Trunis slipped out of the DJ booth so he could join them. My dad was considered the unofficial mayor of Maston, and he was a phony politician to the core. His customers were his marks, and what they didn't know was that no matter how many drinks he poured on the house and bro hugs he shared, he didn't give a fuck about any of them. They were all dollar signs to him. If he poured you a drink for free, it was because he knew you would buy 2 or 3 more. While we had our share of all-night skates and 24-hour skate marathons, the Skateland doors typically closed at 10 p.m. That's when my mother, brother, and I went to work fishing bloody tampons out of shit-filled toilets, airing the lingering cannabis haze out of both bathrooms, scraping bacteria-loaded gum off the rink floor, cleaning the concession kitchen, and taking inventory. Just before midnight, we'd slog into the office, half dead. Our mother would tuck in my brother and me beneath a blanket on the office sofa, our heads opposite one another, as the ceiling shook with the sound of bass-heavy funk. Mom was still on the clock. As soon as she stepped inside the bar, Trunis had her working the door or hustling downstairs like a booze mule to fetch cases of liquor from the basement. There was always some menial task to perform, and she didn't stop moving, while my father kept watch from his corner of the bar, where he could take in the whole scene. In those days, Rick James, a Buffalo native and one of my father's closest friends, stopped by whenever he was in town, parking his Excalibur on the sidewalk out front. His car was a billboard that let the hood know a super freak was in the house. He wasn't the only celebrity that came through. O.J. Simpson was one of the NFL's biggest stars, and he and his Buffalo Bills teammates were regulars, as was Teddy Pendergrass and Sister Sledge. If you don't know the names, look them up. Maybe if I had been older, or my father had been a good man, I might have had some pride in being part of a cultural moment like that. But young kids aren't about that life. It's almost like, no matter who our parents are and what they do, we're all born with a moral compass that's properly tuned. When you're 6, 7, or 8 years old, you know what feels right and what feels way the fuck off. And when you are born into a cyclone of terror and pain, you know it doesn't have to be that way. And that truth nags at you, like a splinter in your jacked-up mind. You can choose to ignore it, but the dull throbbing is always there, as the days and nights bleed together into one blurred memory. Some moments do stick out, though, and one I'm thinking of right now still haunts me. That was the night my mom stepped into the bar before she was expected and found my dad sweet-talking a woman about 10 years her junior. Trunis saw her watching and shrugged while my mother eyeballed him and slugged 2 shots of Johnny Walker Red to calm her nerves. He noticed her reaction and didn't like it one damn bit. She knew how things were, that Trunis ran prostitutes across the border to Fort Erie in Canada. A summer cottage belonging to the president of one of Buffalo's biggest banks doubled as his pop-up brothel. He introduced Buffalo bankers to his girls whenever he needed a longer line of credit, and those loans always came through. My mom knew the young woman she was watching was one of the girls in his stable. She'd seen her before. Once she walked in on them fucking on the Skateland office sofa, where she tucked her children in damn near every night. When she found them together, the woman smiled at her. Trunis shrugged. No, my mom wasn't clueless, but seeing it with her own eyes always burned. Around midnight, my mother drove with one of our security guards to make a bank deposit. He begged her to leave my father. He told her to leave that very night. Maybe he knew what was coming. She did too, But she couldn't run because she had no independent means whatsoever, and she wasn't going to leave us in his hands. Plus, she had no rights to community property because Trunis had always refused to marry her, which was a riddle she was only then starting to solve. My mother came from a solid middle-class family and had always been the virtuous type. He resented that, treated his hookers better than the mother of his sons, and as a result, he had her trapped. She was 100% dependent, and if she wanted to leave, she'd have to walk with nothing at all. My brother and I never slept well at Skateland. The ceiling shook too much because the office was directly below the dance floor. When my mother walked in that night, I was already awake. She smiled, but I noticed the tears in her eyes and remember smelling the scotch on her breath when she scooped me up in her arms as tenderly as she could. My father trailed in after her, sloppy and annoyed. He pulled a pistol from beneath the cushion where I slept. Yes, you heard that right. There was a loaded gun under the cushion on which I slept at 6 years old. He flashed it at me and smiled before concealing it beneath his pant leg in an ankle holster. In his other hand were 2 brown paper shopping bags filled with nearly $10,000 in cash. So far, it was a typical night. My parents didn't speak on the drive home, though the tension between them simmered. My mom pulled into the driveway on Paradise Road just before 6 a.m., a little early by our standards. Trunis stumbled from the car, disabled the alarm, dropped the cash on the kitchen table, and went upstairs. We followed him, and she tucked us both into our beds, kissed me on the forehead, and turned out the light before slipping into the master suite, where she found him waiting, stroking his leather belt. Trunis didn't appreciate being glared at by my mom, especially in public. "This belt came all the way from Texas just to whip you," he said, calmly. Then he started swinging it, buckle first. Sometimes my mother fought back, and she did that night. She threw a marble candlestick at his head. He ducked and it thudded the wall. She ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and cowered on the toilet. He kicked the door down and backhanded her hard. Her head slammed into the wall. She was barely conscious when he grabbed a fistful of her hair and dragged her down the hall. By then, my brother and I had heard the violence, and we watched him drag her all the way down the stairs to the first floor, then crouch over her with a belt in his hand. She was bleeding from the temple and the lip, and the sight of her blood lit a fuse in me. In that moment, my hatred overcame my fear. I ran downstairs and jumped on his back, slammed my tiny fists into his back, and scratched at his eyes. I'd caught him off guard, and he fell to one knee. I wailed on him. "Don't hit my mom!" I yelled. He tossed me to the ground, stalked toward me, belt in hand, then turned toward my mother. "You're raising a gangster," he said, half smiling. I curled into a ball when he started swinging his belt at me. I could feel bruises rise on my back as my mom crawled toward the control pad near the front door. She pressed the panic button, and the house exploded in alarm. He froze, looked toward the ceiling, mopped his brow with his sleeve, took a deep breath, looped and buckled his belt, and went upstairs to wash off all that evil and hate. Police were on their way, and he knew it. My mother's relief was short-lived. When the cops arrived, Trunis met them at the door. They looked over his shoulder toward my mom, who stood several paces behind him, her face swollen and caked with dried blood. But those were different days. There was no Me Too back then. That shit didn't exist, and they ignored her. Trunis told them it was all a whole lot of nothing, just some necessary domestic discipline. "Look at this house. Does it look like I mistreat my wife?" he asked. "I give her mink coats, diamond rings. I bust my ass to give her everything she wants, and she throws a marble candlestick at my head? She's spoiled." The police chuckled along with my father as he walked them to their car. They left without interviewing her. He didn't hit her again that morning. He didn't have to. The psychological damage was done. From that point on, it was clear to us that as far as Trunis and the law were concerned, it was open season, and we were the hunted. Over the next year, our schedule didn't change much, and the beatings continued, while my mother tried to paper over the darkness with swatches of light. She knew I wanted to be a scout, so she signed me up for a local troop. I still remember putting on that navy blue Cub Scout button-down one Saturday. I felt proud wearing a uniform and knowing at least for a few hours I could pretend that I was a normal kid. My mom smiled as we headed for the door. My pride, her smile, wasn't just because of the damn Cub Scouts. They rose up from a deeper place. We were taking action to find something positive for ourselves in a bleak situation. It was proof that we mattered and that we weren't completely powerless. That's when my father came home from the Vermilion Room. "Where are you two going?" He glared at me. I stared at the floor. My mother cleared her throat. "I'm taking David to his first Cub Scout meeting," she said softly. "The hell you are." I looked up, and he laughed as my eyes welled up with tears. "We're going to the track." Within the hour, we'd arrived at Batavia Downs, an old-school harness horse race track, the type where jockeys ride behind the horses in lightweight buggies. My dad grabbed a racing form as soon as we stepped through the gate. For hours, the three of us watched him place bet after bet, chain smoke, drink scotch, and raise holy hell, as every pony he bet on finished out of the money. With my dad raging at the gambling gods and acting a fool, I tried to make myself as small as possible whenever people walked by, but I still stuck out. I was the only kid in the stands dressed like a Cub Scout. I was probably the only black Cub Scout they'd ever seen, and my uniform was a lie. I was a pretender. Trunas lost thousands of dollars that day, and he wouldn't shut up about it on the drive home, his raspy throat raw from nicotine. My brother and I were in the cramped back seat, and whenever he spat out the window, his phlegm boomeranged into my face. Each drop of his nasty saliva on my skin burned like venom and intensified my hate. I'd long since learned that the best way to avoid a beatdown was to make myself as invisible as possible. Avert my eyes, float outside my body, and hope to go unnoticed. It was a practice we'd all honed over the years, but I was done with that shit. I would no longer hide from the devil. That afternoon, as he veered onto the highway and headed home, he continued to rave on, and I mad-dogged him from the back seat. Have you ever heard the phrase, faith over fear? For me, it was hate over fear. He caught my eyes in the rearview mirror. "You got something to say?" "We shouldn't have gone to the track anyway," I said. My brother turned and stared at me like I'd lost my damn mind. My mother squirmed in her seat. "Say that one more time." His words came slow, dripping with dread. I didn't say a word, so he started reaching behind the seat trying to smack me. But I was so small it was easy to hide. The car veered left and right as he was half turned in my direction, punching air. He'd barely touched me, which only stoked his fire. We drove in silence until he caught his breath. "When we get home, you're going to take your clothes off," he said. That's what he'd say when he was ready to bestow a serious beatdown, and there was no avoiding it. I did what I was told. I went into my bedroom and took off my clothes, walked down the hall to his room, closed the door behind me, turned the lights off, then laid across the corner of the bed with my legs dangling, my torso stretched out in front of me, and my ass exposed. That was the protocol, and he'd designed it for maximum psychological and physical pain. The beatings were often brutal, but the anticipation was the worst part. I couldn't see the door behind me, and he'd take his time, letting my dread build. When I heard him open the door, my panic spiked. Even then, the room was so dark I couldn't see much with my peripheral vision, and couldn't prepare for the first smack until his belt hit my skin. It was never just 2 or 3 lickings either. There was no particular count, so we never knew when or if he was going to stop. This beating lasted minutes upon minutes. He started on my butt, but the sting was so bad I blocked it with my hands, so he moved down and started whipping my thighs. When I dropped my hands to my thighs, he swung at my lower back. He belted me dozens of times and was breathless, coughing, and slick with sweat by the time it was over. I was breathing heavy too, but I wasn't crying. His evil was too real, and my hate gave me courage. I refused to give that motherfucker the satisfaction. I just stood up, looked the devil in his eye, limped to my room, and stood in front of a mirror. I was covered in welts from my neck to the crease at the knees. I didn't go to school for several days. When you're getting beat consistently, hope evaporates. You stifle your emotions, but your trauma off-gasses in unconscious ways. After countless beatings she endured and witnessed, this particular beatdown left my mother in a constant fog, a shell of the woman I remembered from a few years before. She was distracted and vacant most of the time, except when he called her name. Then she'd hop too like she was his slave. I didn't know until years later that she was considering suicide. My brother and I took our pain out on each other. We'd sit or stand across from one another, and he would throw punches as hard as he could at me. It usually started out as a game, but he was 4 years older, much stronger, and he connected with all his power. Whenever I'd fall, I'd get up and he'd hit me again as hard as he could, yelling like a martial arts warrior at the top of his lungs, his face twisted with rage. "You're not hurting me! Is that all you fucking have?" I'd shout back. I wanted him to know that I could take more pain than he could ever deliver, but when it was time to fall asleep, and there were no more battles to fight, no place to hide, I wet the bed, nearly every night. My mother's every day was a lesson in survival. She was told she was worthless so often she started to believe it. Everything she did was an effort to appease him so he wouldn't beat her sons or whip her ass. But there were invisible tripwires in her world, and sometimes she never knew when or how she set them off until he slapped the shit out of her. Other times she knew she teed herself up for a vicious beatdown. One day I came home early from school with a nasty earache and laid down on my mother's side of their bed, my left ear throbbing in excruciating pain. With each throb, my hate spiked. I knew I wouldn't be going to the doctor because my father didn't approve of spending his money on doctors or dentists. We didn't have health insurance, a pediatrician, or a dentist. If we got injured or sick, we were told to shake it off because he wasn't down to pay for anything that didn't directly benefit Trunis Goggins. Our health didn't meet that standard, and that pissed me the fuck off. After about a half hour, my mother came upstairs to check on me, and when I rolled onto my back, she could see blood dribbling down the side of my neck and smeared all over the pillow. "That's it," she said. "Come with me." She got me out of bed, dressed me, and helped me to her car, but before she could start the engine, my dad chased us down. "Where you think you're going?" "The emergency room," she said as she turned the ignition. He reached for the handle, but she peeled out first, leaving him in her dust. Furious, he stomped inside, slammed the door, and called out to my brother, "Son, get me a Johnny Walker." Trunis Jr. brought over a bottle of Red Label and a glass from the wet bar. He poured and watched my dad down shot after shot. Each one fueled an inferno. "You and David need to be strong," he raved. "I'm not raising a bunch of faggots, and that's what you'll be if you go to the doctor every time you get a little boo-boo. Understand?" My brother nodded, petrified. "Your last name is Goggins, and we shake it off." According to the doctor we saw that night, my mother got me to the ER just in time. My ear infection was so bad that if we'd waited any longer, I would have lost my hearing in my left ear for life. She risked her ass to save mine, and we both knew she'd pay for it. We drove home in eerie silence. My dad was still stewing at the kitchen table by the time we turned onto Paradise Road, and my brother was still pouring him shots. Trunis Jr. feared our father, but he also worshipped the man and was under his spell. As the firstborn son, he was treated better. Trunis would still lash out at him, but in his warped mind, Trunis Jr. was his prince. "When you grow up, I'm going to want to see you be the man of your house," Trunis told him, "and you're going to see me be a man tonight." Moments after we walked through the front door, Trunis beat our mother senseless, but my brother couldn't watch. Whenever the beatings exploded like a thunderstorm overhead, he'd wait them out in his room. He ignored the darkness because the truth was way too heavy for him to carry. I always paid close fucking attention. During the summers, there was no midweek respite from Trunis, but my brother and I learned to hop on our bikes and stay far away for as long as we could. One day I came home for lunch and entered the house through the garage like normal. My father usually slept deep into the afternoon, so I figured the coast was clear. I was wrong. My father was paranoid. He did enough shady deals to attract some enemies, and he'd set the alarm after we left the house. When I opened the door, sirens screamed and my stomach dropped. I froze, backed up against the wall, and listened for footsteps. I heard the stairs creak and knew I was fucked. He came downstairs in his brown terry cloth robe, pistol in hand, and crossed from the dining room into the living room, his gun out front. I could see the barrel come around the corner slowly. As soon as he cleared the corner, he could see me standing just 20 feet away, but he didn't drop his weapon. He aimed it, right between my eyes. I stared straight at him, blank as possible, my feet anchored to the floorboards. There was no one else in the house, and part of me expected him to pull the trigger. But by this time in my life, I no longer cared if I lived or died. I was an exhausted 8-year-old kid, plain old fucking tired of being terrified of my father, and I was sick of Skateland too. After a minute or two, he lowered his weapon and went back upstairs. By now it was becoming clear that someone was going to die on Paradise Road. My mother knew where Trunus kept his .38. Some days she timed and followed him, envisioned how it would play out. They'd take separate cars to Skateland. She'd grab his gun from beneath the office sofa cushions before he could get there, bring us home early, put us to bed, and wait for him by the front door with his gun in hand. When he pulled up, she'd step out the front door and murder him in his driveway. Leave his body for the milkman to find. My uncles, her brothers, talked her out of it, but they agreed she needed to do something drastic, or she'd be the one lying dead. So, David, something that we didn't put in this book is that your uncles actually tried to talk her into having them do something, right?
Right. So what happened here was my uncle is a horse trainer. He's a horse whisperer, and he also is a great dog trainer. So he had these canines, and he trained these canines, and he trained them in German. And his idea was, look, Jackie, we need to get you out of here. And what's going to happen is you go get the boys, get David and Trunus, and drive to Indiana. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in from California. I'm going to go to Buffalo. And I'm going to bring 2 of my canines with me. And when Trunus, my dad, walks out of Skateland, I'm going to turn my dogs loose. And my mom was like, this plan's not going to work because basically he has a gun. And my uncle was like, well, he can only kill one of my dogs because the other dog's going to go for the guy's throat. So that was the big plan on how to take my dad out. Obviously, it never went down. And I don't believe my uncle was going to ever let it go down. But my mom was at such a horrible place that the only way my mom was going to ever, kind of be satisfied was if someone had a plan to kill him. So that's kind of how that whole thing went.
So he wasn't ever really going to do it, but he was trying to placate her and commit just to get her to leave.
You know what? I have to think to myself, I know my uncle pretty well. I don't think he was going to do it. But you never know when your sister's been getting tortured like this for years. You never know what's in a man's mind.
No, I mean that's the thing is that when this it heats up like a kettle, it's like when domestic violence, even whether it's violent or abuse, even emotional abuse, it just it starts to boil and shit happens. And it could have ended up being your uncle who ends up in jail for trying to defend her. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that happens.
100%.
Yeah.
Somebody was going to end up in jail or dead for sure in that house.
It was an old neighbor who showed her a way. Betty used to live across the street from us, and after she moved, they stayed in touch. Betty was 20 years older than my mom and had the wisdom to match. She encouraged my mother to plan her escape weeks in advance. The first step was getting a credit card in her name. That meant she had to re-earn Trunus's trust because she needed him to co-sign. Betty also reminded my mother to keep their friendship a secret. For a few weeks, Jackie played Trunus, treated him like she did when she was a 19-year-old beauty with stars in her eyes. She made him believe she worshipped him again. And when she slipped a credit card application in front of him, he said he'd be happy to score her a little buying power. When the card arrived in the mail, my mother felt its hard plastic edges through the envelope as relief saturated her mind. She held it at arm's length and admired it. It glowed like a golden ticket. A few days later, she heard my father talking shit about her on the phone to one of his friends while he was having breakfast with my brother and me at the kitchen table. That did it. She walked over to the table and said, "I'm leaving your father. You two can stay, or you can come with me." My dad was stunned silent, and so was my brother. But I shot out of that chair like it was on fire, grabbed a few black garbage bags, and went upstairs to start packing. My brother eventually started gathering his things, too. Before we left, the 4 of us had one last powwow at the kitchen table. Trunus glared at my mother, filled with shock and contempt. "You have nothing, and you are nothing without me," he said. You're uneducated. You don't have any money or prospects. You'll be a prostitute inside a year." He paused, then shifted his focus to my brother and me. "You two are going to grow up to be a couple of faggots. And don't think about coming back, Jackie. I'll have another woman here to take your place 5 minutes after you leave." She nodded and stood. She'd given him her youth, her very soul, and she was finally finished. She packed as little of her past as possible. She left the mink coats and the diamond rings. He could give them to his whore girlfriend as far as she was concerned. Trunis watched us load up into my mom's Volvo, the one vehicle he owned that he wouldn't ride in, our bikes already strapped to the back. We drove off slowly, and at first he didn't budge, but before she turned the corner, I could see him move toward the garage. My mother floored it. Give her credit. She'd planned for contingencies. She figured he'd tail her, so she didn't head west to the interstate that would take us to her parents' place in Indiana. Instead, she drove to Betty's house down a dirt construction road that my dad didn't even know about. Betty had the garage door open when we arrived. We pulled in, Betty yanked the door down, and while my father shot out on the highway in his Corvette to chase after us, we waited right under his nose until just before nightfall. By then we knew he'd be at Skateland opening up. He wasn't going to miss a chance to make some money, no matter what. Shit went wrong about 90 miles outside of Buffalo when the old Volvo started burning oil. Huge plumes of inky exhaust choked from the tailpipe, and my mother spun into panic mode. It was as if she'd been holding it all in, stuffing her fear down deep, hiding it beneath a mask of forced composure, until an obstacle emerged and she fell apart. Tears streaked her face. "What do I do?" my mom asked, her eyes wide as saucers. My brother never wanted to leave, and he told her to turn around. I was riding shotgun. She looked over expectantly. "What do I do?" "We gotta go, Mom," I said. "Mom, we gotta go." She pulled into a gas station in the middle of nowhere. Hysterical, she rushed to a payphone and called Betty. "I can't do this, Betty," she said. "The car broke down. I have to go back." "Where are you?" Betty asked, calmly. "I don't know," my mom replied. "I have no idea where I am." Betty told her to find a gas station attendant. Every station had those back then, and put him on the phone. He explained we were just outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, and after Betty gave him some instructions, he put my mother back on the line. "Jackie, there's a Volvo dealer in Erie. Find a hotel tonight and take the car there tomorrow morning. The attendant is going to put enough oil in the car to get you there." My mother was listening, but she didn't respond. "Jackie, are you hearing me? Do what I say and it will be okay." "Yeah, okay," she whispered, emotionally spent. "Hotel. Volvo dealer. Got it." I don't know what Erie is like now, but back then there was only one decent hotel in town, a Holiday Inn, not far from the Volvo dealership. My brother and I followed my mom to the reception desk, where we were hit with more bad news. They were fully booked. My mother's shoulders slumped. My brother and I stood on either side of her, holding our clothes in black trash bags. We were the picture of desperation, and the night manager saw it. "Look, I'll set you up with some rollaway beds in the conference room," he said. "There's a bathroom down there, but you have to be out early because we have a conference starting at 9 a.m. Grateful, we bedded down in that conference room with its industrial carpet and fluorescent lights, our own personal purgatory. We were on the run and on the ropes, but my mother hadn't folded. She laid back and stared at the ceiling tiles until we nodded off. Then she slipped into an adjacent coffee shop to keep an anxious eye on our bikes and on the road all night long. We were waiting outside that Volvo dealership when the garage opened up, which gave the mechanics just enough time to source the part we needed to get us back on the road before their day was done. We left Erie at sunset and drove all night, arriving at my grandparents' house in Brazil, Indiana, 8 hours later. My mom wept as she parked next to their old wooden house before dawn, and I understood why. Our arrival felt significant, then and now. I was still only 8 years old, but already in a second phase of life. I didn't know what awaited me, what awaited us in that small, rural, southern Indiana town, and I didn't much care. All I knew was that we'd escaped from hell, and for the first time in my life, we were free from the devil himself. We stayed with my grandparents for the next 6 months, and I enrolled in second grade, for the second time, at a local Catholic school called Annunciation. I was the only 8-year-old in second grade, but none of the other kids knew I was repeating a year, and there was no doubt that I needed it. I could barely read, but I was lucky enough to have Sister Catherine as my teacher. Short and petite, Sister Catherine was 60 years old and had one gold front tooth. She was a nun, but didn't wear the habit. She was also grumpy as hell and took no shit, and I loved her thug ass. Annunciation was a small school. Sister Catherine taught all of first and second grade in a single classroom, and with only 18 kids to teach, she wasn't willing to shirk her responsibility and blame my academic struggles or anybody's bad behavior on learning disabilities or emotional problems. She didn't know my backstory and didn't have to. All that mattered to her was that I turned up at her door with a kindergarten education, and it was her job to shape my mind. She had every excuse in the world to farm me out to some specialist or label me a problem, but that wasn't her style. She started teaching before labeling kids was a normal thing to do, and she embodied the no excuses mentality that I needed if I was going to catch up. Sister Catherine is the reason why I'll never trust a smile or judge a scowl. My dad smiled a hell of a lot, and he didn't give two shits about me. But grouchy Sister Catherine cared about us, cared about me. She wanted us to be our very best. I know this because she proved it by spending extra time with me, as much time as it took, until I retained my lessons. Before the year was out, I could read at a second grade level. Trunis Jr. hadn't adjusted nearly as well. Within a few months, he was back in Buffalo, shadowing my father and working that Skateland detail like he'd never left. By then, we'd moved into a place of our own, a 600-square-foot, two-bedroom apartment at Lamplight Manor, a public housing block that cost us $7 a month. My father, who earned thousands every night, sporadically sent $25 every 3 or 4 weeks, if that, for child support, while my mother earned a few $100s a month with her department store job. In her off hours, she was taking courses at Indiana State University, which cost money too. The point is, we had gaps to fill, so my mother enrolled in welfare and received $123 a month and food stamps. They wrote her a check for the first month, but when they found out she owned a car, they disqualified her, explaining that if she sold her car, they'd be happy to help. The problem is, we lived in a rural town with a population of about 8,000 that didn't have a mass transit system. We needed that car so I could get to school and she could get to work and take night classes. She was hell-bent on changing her life circumstances and found a workaround through the Aid to Dependent Children program. She arranged for our check to go to my grandmother, who signed it over to her. But that didn't make life easy. How far can $123 really go? I vividly recall one night we were so broke, we drove home on a gas tank that was near empty, to a bare refrigerator and a past-due electric bill, with no money in the bank. Then I remembered that we had 2 mason jars filled with pennies and other loose change. I grabbed them off the shelf. "Mom, let's count our change." She smiled. Growing up, her father had taught her to pick up the change she found on the street. He was molded by the Great Depression and knew what it was like to be down and out. "You never know when you might need it," he'd say. When we lived in hell, carrying home thousands of dollars every night, the notion that we would ever run out of money sounded ludicrous. But my mother retained her childhood habit. Trunis used to belittle her for it, but now it was time to see how far found money could take us. We dumped that change out on the living room floor and counted out enough to cover the electric bill, fill the gas tank, and buy groceries. We even had enough to buy burgers at Hardee's on the way home. These were dark times, but we were managing. Barely. My mother missed Trunis Jr. terribly, but she was pleased that I was adjusting and making friends. I'd had a good year at school, and from our first night in Indiana, I hadn't wet the bed once. It seemed that I was healing, but my demons weren't gone. They were dormant, and when they came back, they hit hard. 3rd grade was a shock to my system, not just because we had to learn cursive when I was still getting the hang of reading block letters, but because our teacher, Miss D, was nothing like Sister Catherine. Our class was still small. We had about 20 kids total, split between 3rd and 4th grade, but she didn't handle it nearly as well, and wasn't interested in taking the extra time I required. My trouble started with the standardized tests we took during our first couple of weeks of class. Mine came back a mess. I was still way behind the other kids, and I had trouble building on lessons from the previous days, let alone the previous academic year. Sister Catherine considered similar signs as cues to dedicate more time with her weakest student, and she challenged me daily. Miss D looked for a way out. Within the first month of class, she told my mother that I belonged in a different school, one for special students. Every kid knows what special means. It means you are about to be stigmatized for the rest of your damn life. It means that you are not normal. The threat alone was a trigger, and I developed a stutter almost overnight. My thought-to-speech flow was jammed up with stress and anxiety, and it was at its worst in school. Imagine being the only black kid in class, in an entire school, and enduring the daily humiliation of also being the dumbest. I felt like everything I tried to do or say was wrong, and it got so bad that instead of responding and skipping like scratched vinyl whenever the teacher called my name, I often chose to keep quiet. It was all about limiting exposure to save face. Miss D didn't even attempt to empathize. She went straight to frustration and vented it by yelling at me, sometimes when she was leaning down, her hand on the back of my chair, her face just inches from my own. She had no idea the Pandora's box she was tearing open. Once, school was a safe harbor, the one place I knew I couldn't be hurt, but in Indiana, it morphed into my torture chamber. Miss D wanted me out of her classroom, and the administration supported her until my mother fought for me. The principal agreed to keep me enrolled if my mother signed off on time with a speech therapist, and put me into group therapy with a local shrink they recommended. The psychologist's office was adjacent to a hospital, which was exactly where you'd want to put it if you were trying to make a little kid doubt himself. It was like a bad movie. The shrink set up 7 chairs in a semicircle around him, but some of the kids wouldn't or couldn't sit still. One child wore a helmet and banged his head against the wall repeatedly. Another kid stood up while the doctor was mid-sentence, walked toward a far corner of the room, and pissed in the trash can. The kid sitting next to me was the most normal person in the group, and he had set his own house on fire. I can remember staring up at the shrink on my first day thinking, there's no way I belong here. That experience kicked my social anxiety up several notches. My stutter was out of control. My hair started falling out, and white splotches bloomed on my dark skin. The doctor diagnosed me as an ADHD case and prescribed Ritalin, but my problems were more complex. I was suffering from toxic stress. The type of physical and emotional abuse I was exposed to has been proven to have a range of side effects on young children, because in our early years the brain grows and develops so rapidly. If during those years your father is an evil motherfucker hell-bent on destroying everyone in his house, stress spikes. And when those spikes occur frequently enough, you can draw a line across the peaks. That's your new baseline. It puts kids in a permanent fight or flight mode. Fight or flight can be a great tool when you're in danger because it amps you up to battle through or sprint from trouble, but it's no way to live. I'm not the type of guy to try to explain everything with science, but facts are facts. I've read that some pediatricians believe toxic stress does more damage to kids than polio or meningitis. I know firsthand that it leads to learning disabilities and social anxiety, because according to doctors, it limits language development and memory, which makes it difficult for even the most gifted student to recall what they have already learned. Looking at the long game, when kids like me grow up, they face an increased risk for clinical depression, heart disease, obesity, and cancer. Not to mention smoking, alcoholism, and drug abuse. Those raised in abusive households have an increased probability of being arrested as a juvenile by 53%. Their odds of committing a violent crime as an adult are increased by 38%. I was the poster child of that generic term we've all heard before, at-risk youth. My mother wasn't the one raising a thug. Look at the numbers and it's clear. If anyone put me on a destructive path, it was Trunis Goggins. I didn't stay in group therapy for long, and I didn't take Ritalin either. My mom picked me up after my second session, and I sat in the front seat of her car wearing a 1,000-yard stare. "Mom, I'm not going back," I said. "These boys are crazy." She agreed. But I was still a damaged kid. And while there are proven interventions on the best way to teach and manage kids who suffer from toxic stress, it's fair to say that Miss D didn't get those memos. I can't blame her for her own ignorance. The science wasn't nearly as clear in the 1980s as it is now. All I know is, Sister Catherine toiled in the trenches with the same malformed kid that Miss D dealt with, but she maintained high expectations and didn't let her frustration overwhelm her. She had the mindset of, look, everybody learns in a different way, and we're going to figure out how you learn. She deduced that I needed repetition, that I needed to solve the same problems over and over again in a different way to learn, and she knew that took time. Miss D was all about productivity. She was saying, keep up or get out. Meanwhile, I felt backed into a corner. I knew if I didn't show some improvement, I would eventually be shipped out to that special black hole for good, so I found a solution. I started cheating my ass off. Studying was hard, especially with my fucked up brain, but I was a damn good cheat. I copied friends' homework and scanned my neighbors' work during tests. I even copied the answers on the standardized tests that didn't have any impact on my grades. It worked. My rising test scores placated Miss D, and my mother stopped getting calls from school. I thought I'd solved a problem when really I was creating new ones by taking the path of least resistance. My coping mechanism confirmed that I would never learn squat at school and that I would never catch up, which pushed me closer toward a flunked-out fate. The saving grace of those early years in Brazil was that I was way too young to understand the kind of prejudice I would soon face in my new hick hometown. Whenever you're the only one of your kind, you're in danger of being pushed toward the margins, suspected and disregarded, bullied and mistreated by ignorant people. That's just the way life is, especially back then. And by the time that reality kicked me in the throat, my life had already become a full-fledged fuck you fortune cookie. Whenever I cracked it open, I got the same message. You were born to fail. Man, David Goggins, that's a tough 8-9 years.
Yeah, it definitely did damage on me, man. It did a lot of damage on me.
We made a choice here when you were talking about, we talked about maybe a half dozen or more beatdowns when we were going through it, and you zeroed in on these ones as kind of the symbolic ones that you wanted to focus on.
Right.
And I'm curious why you chose these, and was it hard to minimize? Was there ever a part of you that felt like you're actually minimizing what you went through?
Oh, I was definitely minimizing it, but I can give you a great answer on why I chose these. It was kind of like I guess, the most bang for your buck. And the reason why I say that is for a young kid to physically see your mom, physically and mentally, see your mom changing. And these moments are some of the breaking moments of my mom. Like, my mom was a rock. She was a rock throughout most of this because she had to be for myself and my brother. But this moment with the whole Cub Scout scene, and when I got home, that beating, I mean, it was something that she witnessed. And the look on her face, it was even worse than the beating I received. I had just gotten the VFW award for the for Americanism, the Americanism VFW award, and I was thanking people up there, and I was thanking my uncle, and I was thanking the servicemen and women.
That was earlier summer 2018, right?
Right. It just happened not too long ago, and I was thanking people, and I got to my mom, and I had thousands of people staring at me. And I had delivered several speeches before in my life. And when I was trying to thank her, the flood of this memory kind of came to my mind. And I had to put my head down for the fact that I was choked up and tearing up. And it wasn't the beating I got. Her face is forever tattooed in my mind. And that's why I chose this one, because this one was the one that literally changed me. And it changed my mom.
The one of the Cub Scout one, or the one after the earache?
Sorry about that. There was a couple of them there. It was the one after the Cub Scout one, when my dad had me laying across the bed for about 45 minutes. Because when I walked out, usually it takes a while for kind of welts to kind of get there.
Yep.
These welts were immediate. And the black and blue, and I was trying to hide in my bedroom. And when she walked in my bedroom, I was in the bed. And when she pulled the covers out and she saw my body, that's when it all changed. And I was a part of that moment when I saw the look in her eye, and we kind of met eyes, and it was like, oh man, you don't want to ever see your mom look like that. It was just horrible.
See, this is the behind the scenes shit right here, because most people, if they just read the book, they'd feel like, okay, the arc that you're sharing in this chapter is the arc of you kind of going through the beatings, when in reality, you chose them because it's the arc of your mother's kind of destruction.
Exactly. Another thing we don't talk about here is, as embarrassing as it is to me, I went to bed every night in Buffalo, New York. And my mom, she would go in almost every night. So she'd wake up almost every night, and she would take my sheets and hide them and try to wash them, because my dad would beat me senselessly for wetting the bed, because, that was all about, you're not a man. You peeing in the bed was not a man, but I was a big tough guy when it came to challenging my father. But at nighttime, that demon would come and roost in my head when I would sleep. And that's why I would pee in the bed every night, because I was truly afraid and I was overcoming myself to protect my mom so often. But something's got to give. And that's what gave.
And if you could approximate how many times you were beaten by your father or you saw your mother beaten, would it be in the hundreds?
I would say it would easily be in the hundreds. I would get a whip, and there's one time I had my bike, as we were talking about my bike here, me and my brother ride bikes. There was one time my dad told me he was at the kitchen table, and the kitchen table had a window that looked out. And he said, David, don't ride in the street. We all know what that means. Don't ride in the street. Roger that. I'm not going to ride in the street. So I was turning my bike around, and my bike wheel, I was in someone's driveway, and my dad could see me from the window where he was sitting at. And I was turning my bike around, and my front tire literally touched the street as I was turning around. I didn't ride in the street. I was turning around. My front tire literally grazed the actual street, and I got back on the sidewalk. When I got inside that house, he beat the shit out of me for that. So it didn't have to be a big reason. It just had to be like, if he thought that you disobeyed him, it was game on. It was game on.
Crazy, man. Well, I think it's amazing that you're sharing this much, and I know you're about to ask the readers and the listeners to kind of divulge their material here in the first challenge. And so I want to go through the challenge, and then we can talk about this challenge and kind of why you decided to challenge your readers and listeners in the book. I'll start going through it now, if you don't mind.
No, it's perfect, man. Let's do it.
Challenge number 1. My bad cards arrived early and stuck around a while, but everyone gets challenged in life at some point. What was your bad hand? What kind of bullshit did you contend with growing up? Were you beaten? Abused? Bullied? Did you ever feel insecure? Maybe your limiting factor is that you grew up so supported and comfortable, you never pushed yourself. What are the current factors limiting your growth and success? Is someone standing in your way at work or school? Are you underappreciated and overlooked for opportunities? What are the long odds you're up against right now? Are you standing in your own way? Break out your journal. If you don't have one, buy one. Or start one on your laptop, tablet, or in the Notes app on your smartphone, and write them all out in minute detail. Don't be bland with this assignment. I showed you every piece of my dirty laundry. If you are hurt or are still in harm's way, tell the story in full. Give your pain shape. Absorb its power, because you are about to flip that shit. You will use your story, this list of excuses, these very good reasons why you shouldn't amount to a damn thing, to fuel your ultimate success. Sounds fun, right? Yeah, it won't be. But don't worry about that yet. We'll get there. For now, just take inventory. Once you have your list, share it with whoever you want. For some, it may mean logging onto social media, posting a picture, and writing out a few lines about how your own past or present circumstances challenge you to the depth of your soul. If that's you, use the hashtags, #badhand, #can'thurtme. Otherwise, acknowledge and accept it privately. Whatever works for you. I know it's hard, but this act alone will begin to empower you to overcome. So obviously, judging on this chapter, you feel like there's power in taking inventory and owning your story. Do you want to explain this challenge and why it's so important?
Well, I realized so all this stuff made me so weak, because it's how I looked at it. I looked at it that I had a jacked up foundation. I looked at it that my mom became, my dad took her soul. And so as you'll read further and further on, that my mindset was controlling my destiny. When you have a poopy pants type of mentality, and this happened to me and that happened to me and woe is me, and you're kicking rocks down the street with your head down, versus looking at this, and you have to find power. You have to find power in everything negative in your life. You have to do that. So by you writing this stuff down, by you owning it, this is now a part of your life, whether you like it or not. So if that's a fact, If it's a fact that this is now a part of my life, whether I like it or not, you better go ahead and start liking it. You better find power within your own story. You better look at your story, if it's a bad one, as, hey, motherfucker, you can't hurt me. Whatever that may be, you better start owning that and flipping and start saying to yourself, yeah, there's a lot of people out here who might have had a better life than you, and they may have a little bit of a head start on life than what you had. But that should be very powerful, for you or anybody else. Why is that powerful? I can tell you why. Because from that right there alone, you can start slowly catching these people, realizing where you come from, realizing the pain you endured, the suffering you endured. If you were bullied, if you have a bad family, whatever, you have to use this and flip the negative upside down and find positive power to fuel you forward. Stop kicking a rock down the road, own it, and make it a part of your life.
As if the survival through a trying experience, experience where you suffered, if you survive that right there, that's power, right? I mean, you can use it to continue to push you further.
That's right. And it's a lot more than surviving. You want to thrive. You want to be that person who was given a fucked up deck of, just a fucked up hand.
Yeah.
And that person says, okay, you know what? I have a bunch of 2s and 3s. There's a card game called War. And in War, what happens is you want to have the highest cards. One person flips over a card, and then you flip over a card. The highest card wins. I looked at my life at this time as having a bunch of 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, maybe 110. And having that messed up hand, if you can still win the game of War, that gives you a ton of power. So it's about more than survival. It's about thriving in a situation that most people think is impossible for you to be truly amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you're laying out. You had a bad hand. You were the at-risk youth. You had all the excuses. The chapter 1 is your list of excuses. You could have packed it in.
That's right. I should have been a statistic. I should have been a statistic, which is the beauty of it all. That's the power of it all. People start seeing where I gauge my power is from the crap I lived in. There's so much power in this crap that we live in that people just don't look at it that way. But it's just a powerful thing that we can harness if we know how to look at it the right way. We have to learn how to look at it the right way. And looking at it the right way is owning it first.
But it would be a little while before you were able to fully start to harness it in any productive way.
100%. It's a long time coming. It's a long time coming.
And just a quick word on why you decided to include challenges in your book.
Well, the thing about it is you have to have something that you can look at and say, okay, how can I fix this part of my life? And like we talk about, everything in life is about repetition. How, Sister Catherine, I thought for sure there was no way in hell I was going to ever even pass the 2nd grade. But Sister Catherine taught me one thing. Through reps, you have to put the repetition in. And these challenges are doing exactly that. A lot of people, they do something once and they give up on it. This is something that you have to do every single day of your life. You have to hold yourself at this standard. It can't be something you do every now and then, and then you get tired of it and you move on. This is a discipline. Right now, challenge 1 is starting the road down self-discipline. No one is going to come to help you. No one's coming to save you. All that crap is now yours. You have to develop, the key word there is self-discipline. And that's how you're going to overcome every single challenge of your life. This is challenge 1 that I'm giving you in my book. Tons of you have tons of challenges that you're facing every day, but it comes to repetition and self-discipline.
So you set up a kind of a protocol to be able to, and some of these challenges the reader can go back to over and over again whenever they have trouble. And the idea is to go through these challenges to develop the discipline and the mental toughness to push forward and to progress in their lives. Exactly.
It's all about progressing. If you're not moving forward, either you're getting better or you're getting worse. If you're telling somebody, oh, I'm about the same, that means you're getting worse. These challenges are also, they're huge. And, I wrote this book, I'm my own hero. And what that's all about is, we live our lives. We look up to so many people. We look up to, maybe you look up to a golfer or a scientist or a basketball player, whatever. These people, normal people, we are all normal people. We will all, someone will always let you down. Bottom line. So the whole thing about this is these challenges are here for you to be your own hero. I don't want you to look up to me. Hopefully somewhere in here, I'm not trying to be your hero. I am not. I want you to get these challenges, flip these challenges upside down, make these challenges work for you so then you can be your own hero and start seeing yourself the way, you were here to be seen.
I love that. It's very much in line with the way humans have always told each other stories and finding the hero story, because within the hero story is a message for you. For you to not only tell your story, but then to give a framework for people to then do that for themselves. I think that's really empowering. And that's one of the reasons I'm super excited to be reading this book and working on it with you.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway through this whole book will always be coming back to the individual. I want the individual to always know that this isn't about me. Yeah, you are reading my life. You are reading my life. When I say can't hurt me, I want everybody out there to take that as their own. So just understand that you need to be your own hero. So that's where it all starts at, right there.
Chapter 2. Truth Hurts. Wilmoth Irving was a new beginning. Up until he met my mother and asked for her phone number, all I'd known was misery and struggle. When the money was good, our lives were defined by trauma. Once we were free of my father, we were swept under by our own PTSD-level dysfunction and poverty. Then, when I was in 4th grade, she met Wilmoth, a successful carpenter and general contractor from Indianapolis. She was attracted to his easy smile and laid-back style. There was no violence in him. He gave us permission to exhale. With him around, it felt like we had some support, like something good was finally happening to us. She laughed when they were together. Her smile was bright and real. She stood up a little straighter. He gave her pride and made her feel beautiful again. As for me, Wilmoth became as close to a healthy father figure as I've ever had. He didn't coddle me. He didn't tell me he loved me or any of that fake-ass sappy shit. But he was there. Basketball had been an obsession of mine since grade school. It was the core of my relationship with my best friend, Johnny Nichols, and Wilmoth had game. He and I hit the courts together all the time. He showed me moves, tuned up my defensive discipline, and helped me develop a jump shot. The three of us celebrated birthdays and holidays together, and the summer before 8th grade, he got down on one knee and asked my mother to make it official. Wilmoth lived in Indianapolis, and our plan was to move in with him the following summer. Though he wasn't nearly as rich as Trunis, he made a nice living, and we looked forward to city life again. Then, in 1989, the day after Christmas, everything stopped. We hadn't made the full-time move to Indy yet, and he'd spent Christmas Day with us at my grandparents' place in Brazil. The next day, he had a basketball game in his men's league, and he'd invited me to sub for one of his teammates. I was so excited I'd packed my bags 2 days early, but that morning he told me I couldn't come after all. "I'm going to keep you back here this time, little David," he said. I dropped my head and sighed. He could tell I was upset and tried to reassure me. "Your mom is going to drive up in a few days and we can play ball then." I nodded reluctantly, but I wasn't raised to pry into the affairs of adults and knew I wasn't owed an explanation or make-up game. My mother and I watched from the front porch as he backed out of the carport, smiled, and gave us that crisp single wave of his. Then he drove off. It was the last time we'd ever see him alive. He played in his men's league game that night as planned, and drove home alone to the house with the white lions. Whenever he gave directions to friends, family, or delivery guys, that's how he always described his ranch-style house, its driveway framed by 2 white lion sculptures elevated on pillars. He pulled between them and into the garage, where he could enter the house directly, oblivious to the danger moving in from behind. He never did close that garage door. They'd been staking him out for hours, waiting for a window, and as he climbed out from the driver's side door, they stepped from the shadows and fired from close range. He was shot 5 times in the chest. When he dropped to the floor of his garage, The gunman stepped over him and delivered a kill shot right between his eyes. Wilmoth's father lived a few blocks away, and when he drove by the White Lions the next morning, he noticed his son's garage door open and knew something was wrong. He walked up the driveway and into the garage, where he sobbed over his dead son. Wilmoth was just 43 years old. I was still at my grandmother's house when Wilmoth's mother called moments later. She hung up and motioned me to her side to break the news. I thought about my mom. Wilmoth had been her savior. She'd been coming out of her shell, opening up, ready to believe in good things. What would this do to her? Would God ever give her a damn break? It started as a simmer, but within seconds my rage overwhelmed me. I broke free of my grandmother, punched the refrigerator, and left a dent. We drove to our place to find my mother, who was already frantic because she hadn't heard from Wilmoth. She called his house just before we arrived, and when a detective picked up the phone, it puzzled her. But she didn't expect this. How could she? We saw her confusion as my grandmother walked over, peeled the phone from her fingers, and sat her down. She didn't believe us at first. Wilmoth was a prankster, and this was just the kind of fucked up stunt he might try to pull off. Then she remembered he'd been shot 2 months before. He told her that the guys who'd done it weren't after him, that those bullets were meant for someone else, and because they merely grazed him, she decided to forget about the whole thing. Until that moment, she never suspected that Wilmoth had some secret street life she knew nothing about, and the police never did find out exactly why he was shot and killed. The speculation was that he was involved in a shady business deal, or a drug deal gone bad. My mother was still in denial when she packed a bag, but she included a dress for his funeral. When we arrived, his house was wrapped in a ribbon of yellow police tape, like a fucked up Christmas gift. This was no prank. My mom parked, ducked under the tape, and I followed right behind her to the front door. On the way, I remember glancing to my left, trying to get a glimpse of the scene where Wilmoth had been killed. His cold blood was still pooled on the garage floor. I was a 14-year-old wandering through an active crime scene, but nobody, not my mother, not Wilmoth's family, and not even the police seemed disturbed by me being there, absorbing the heavy vibe of my would-be stepfather's murder. As fucked up as it sounds, the police allowed my mom to stay in Wilmoth's house that night. Rather than stay alone, she had her brother-in-law there, armed with his 2 guns in case the killers came back. I wound up in a back bedroom at Wilmoth's sister's place, a dark and spooky house a few miles away, and left alone all night. The house was furnished with one of those analog cabinet television sets, with 13 channels on a dial. Only 3 channels came in static-free, and I kept it on the local news. They ran the same tape on a loop every 30 minutes. Footage of my mom and me ducking under police tape, then watching Wilmoth get wheeled on a gurney toward a waiting ambulance, a sheet over his body. It was like a horror scene. I sat there all alone, watching the same footage over and over. My mind was a broken record that kept skipping into darkness. The past had been bleak, and now our sky-blue future had been blown the fuck up too. There would be no reprieve. Only my familiar, fucked-up reality, choking out all light. Each time I watched, my fear grew until it filled the room, and still, I could not stop. A few days after we buried Wilmoth, and just after the New Year, I boarded a school bus in Brazil, Indiana. I was still grieving, and my head was spinning because my mother and I hadn't decided whether or not we were staying in Brazil or moving to Indianapolis as planned. We were in limbo, and she remained in a state of shock. She still hadn't cried over Wilmoth's death. Instead, she became emotionally vacant again. It was as if all the pain she'd experienced in her life resurfaced as one gaping wound she disappeared into, and there was no reaching her in that void. In the meantime, school was starting up, so I played along, looking for any shred of normal I could hang on to. But it was hard. I rode a bus to school most days, and my first day back I couldn't shake a memory I buried from the year before. That morning I slid into a seat above the back left tire overlooking the street as usual. When we arrived at school, the bus pulled up to the curb. We needed to wait for the ones ahead of us to move before we could get off. In the meantime, a car pulled alongside us, and a cute, overeager little boy ran toward our bus carrying a platter of cookies. The driver didn't see him. The bus jerked forward. I noticed the alarmed look on his mother's face before the sudden crush of blood splattered my window. His mother howled in horror. She wasn't among us anymore. She looked and sounded like a fierce, wounded animal as she literally pulled the hair from her head by the roots. Soon sirens wailed in the distance and screamed closer by the second. The little boy was about 6 years old. The cookies were a present for the driver. We were all ordered off the bus, and as I walked by the tragedy, for some reason, call it human curiosity, call it the magnetic pull of dark to dark, I peeked under the bus and saw him. His head was nearly as flat as paper. His brains and blood mingled under the carriage like spent oil. For a full year I hadn't thought of that image even once, but Wilmeth's death reawakened it, and now it was all I could think about. I was beyond the pale. Nothing mattered to me. I'd seen enough to know that the world was filled with human tragedy, and that it would just keep piling up in drifts until it swallowed me. Man, I remember when you first told me that story, and we were first starting to work together, and I'm like skeptical journalist guy, and even though I listened to your podcast and was a fan even before we'd ever hooked up,
Right.
I was like, when you told me this story, I thought to myself, man, can that be true?
Right.
And it is, it is true. There's newspaper reports over it, and everything that you say in this book, we've checked out 100 different ways. And I mean, it is almost impossible to believe that so much you could have seen and witnessed so much, but it's 100% true. And I can't even imagine that scene. And the funny thing is, not funny, but like the odd thing is you actually suppressed this memory. You lived it, you felt it, but you didn't even talk about it. You didn't brought it up to your mother. Nothing ever happened. And then after Wilmeth's death, a full year later, that's when it came out.
Right. So what I was really good at growing up was I realized my mom was severely damaged, and I became the man of the house. And my whole job was to show no weakness. She had enough to worry about, and I didn't want her ever worrying about me. So when that little boy, I mean, it was horrible. It was just horrible to see that. And I was in 7th grade, and my little brain was just, I couldn't even comprehend what I just saw. And to see a mom, that scene, to see a woman yanking her hair out of her head and just going all at it. And then I didn't know what that blood was. I didn't even know that it was blood. I didn't know what had even happened, because I looked forward, and when I looked forward, all I heard was screaming. And when I looked over at the screaming, the lady was literally right across from me, and I saw little specks of like, I didn't know it was blood then, but I saw little specks of, it looked like brown stuff on my window. And I just saw the woman looking down. So I got my window, and it was, it was in the dead of winter. So that's the thing about it. It was literally December around the 22nd, 23rd, 24th. A year before Wilmeth died, he got murdered the day after Christmas. So it was almost a year to the day when this happened. So I got the window, and I pulled it down, and I looked down, and what I saw was this. It looked like just a flat as a pancake. It's just flat as a pancake, man. It's even hard to talk about now, and that stuck with me forever. But the thing about it is, I always would get things, put them back in my head, and move on. Just get hard. And what did it for me was I came home after seeing this little boy get run over by a bus. And once again, it was that gurney. It was on TV, and I saw that gurney, and I think watching that gurney with that little boy, and then seeing Wilmeth repeatedly in the gurney, those two gurneys, just seeing that on TV, it just sparked up this stuff, and I'll never forget it, man.
And then getting back on the bus, so it was almost like you were going into this deja vu you couldn't get out of.
Right, and it was horrible, and I literally couldn't sleep in my bed. I'll never forget, after Wilmeth got murdered and all this stuff all these horrible demons came to roost in my head. I just couldn't sleep in the bed. And I remember sleeping on the floor in the fetal position for months. And there was one night, I thought I was very like what's wrong with me? So I actually went in my mom's room one night to just, talk to her. And I walked in her room. I'll never forget finding her in her chair in the fetal position. And then years later, she would tell me that, she couldn't sleep in her bed. Years later, so she slept in the chair and I slept in the floor, both of us in the fetal position.
I couldn't sleep in bed anymore. Neither could my mother. She slept in her armchair with the television on blast, or with a book in her hands. For a little while, I tried to curl up in bed at night, but would always wake in the fetal position on the floor. Eventually I gave in and bedded down low to the ground. Maybe because I knew, if I could find comfort at the bottom place, there would be no more falling. We were two people in dire need of the fresh start we thought we had coming, so even without Wilmoth, we made the move to Indianapolis. My mother set me up for entry exams at Cathedral High School, a private college preparatory academy in the heart of the city. As usual, I cheated, and off a smart motherfucker too. When my acceptance letter and class schedule came in the mail the summer before freshman year, I was looking at a full slate of AP classes. I hacked my way through, cheating and copying, and managed to make the freshman basketball team, which was one of the best freshman teams in the entire state. We had several future college players, and I started at point guard. That was a confidence boost, but not the kind I could build on because I knew I was an academic fraud. Plus, the school cost my mom way too much money. So after only 1 year at Cathedral, she pulled the plug. I started my sophomore year at North Central High School, a public school with 4,000 kids in a majority black neighborhood, and on my first day I turned up like some preppy-ass white boy. My jeans were definitely too tight, and my collared shirt was tucked into a waistline cinched with a braided belt. The only reason I didn't get completely laughed out of the building was because I could ball. My sophomore year was all about being cool. I switched up my wardrobe, which was increasingly influenced by hip-hop culture, and hung out with gangbangers and other borderline delinquents, which meant I didn't always go to school. One day my mom came home in the middle of the day and found me sitting around our dining room table with what she described as 10 thugs. She wasn't wrong. Within a few weeks, she packed us up and moved us back to Brazil, Indiana. I enrolled at Northview High School the week of basketball tryouts, and I remember showing up at lunchtime when the cafeteria was full. There were 1,200 kids enrolled at Northview, only 5 of which were black, and the last time any of them had seen me, I looked a lot like them. Not anymore. I strolled into school that day wearing pants 5 sizes too big and sagged way down low. I also wore an oversized Chicago Bulls jacket with a backward hat, cocked to the side. Within seconds, all eyes were upon me. Teachers, students, and administrative staff stared at me like I was some exotic species. I was the first thuggish black kid many of them had seen in real life. My mere presence had stopped the music. I was the needle being dragged across vinyl, scratching a whole new rhythm. And like hip-hop itself, everybody noticed, but not everyone liked what they heard. I strutted through the scene like I gave no fucks. But that was a lie. I acted all kinds of cocky, and my entrance was brash as hell, but I felt very insecure going back there. Buffalo had been like living in a blazing inferno. My early years in Brazil were a perfect incubator for post-traumatic stress, and before I left I was delivered a double dose of death trauma. Moving to Indianapolis had been an opportunity to escape pity and leave all that behind. Class wasn't easy for me, but I'd made friends and developed a new style. Now, coming back, I looked different enough on the outside to perpetuate an illusion that I'd changed. But in order to change, you have to work through shit, confront it, and get real. I hadn't done a shred of that hard work. I was still a dumb kid with nothing solid to lean on, and basketball tryouts ripped away any confidence I had left. When I got to the gym, they made me suit up in uniform rather than wear my more generic gym clothes. Back then, the style was getting baggy and oversized, which Chris Webber and Jalen Rose of the Fab Five would make famous at the University of Michigan. The coaches in Brazil didn't have their fingers on that pulse. They put me in the tighty-whitey version of basketball shorts, which strangled my balls, hugged my thighs super tight, and felt all kinds of wrong. I was trapped in the coach's preferred dream state, a Larry Bird time warp, which made sense because Larry Legend was basically a patron saint in Brazil and all of Indiana. In fact, his daughter went to our school. We were friends, but that didn't mean I wanted to dress like him. Then there was my etiquette. In Indianapolis, the coaches let us talk shit on the court. If I made a good move or hit a shot in your face, I talked about your mama or your girlfriend. In Indy, I'd done research on my shit-talking. I got good at it. I was the Draymond Green of my school, and it was all part of basketball culture in the city. Back in farm country, that cost me. When tryouts started, I handled the rock a bunch, and when I crossed some of the kids over and made them look bad, I let them and the coaches know. My attitude embarrassed the coaches, who were apparently ignorant that their hero, Larry Legend, was an all-time great trash talker. And it wasn't long before they took the ball out of my hands and put me in the front court, a position I'd never played before. I was uncomfortable down low and played like it. That shut me up good. Meanwhile, Johnny was dominating. My only saving grace that week was getting back with Johnny Nichols. We'd stayed close while I was away, and our marathon one-on-one battles were back on full swing. Though he was undersized, he was always a nice player, and he was one of the best on the floor during tryouts. He was draining shots, seeing the open man, and running the court. It was no surprise when he made the varsity squad, but we were both shocked that I barely made JV. I was crushed, and not because of basketball tryouts. To me, that outcome was another symptom of something else I'd been feeling. Brazil looked the same, but shit felt different this time around. Grade school had been hard academically, but even though we were one of only a few black families in town, I didn't notice or feel any palpable racism. As a teenager, I experienced it everywhere, and it wasn't because I'd become ultra-sensitive. Outright racism had always been there. Not long after moving back to Brazil, my cousin Damien and I went to a party way out in the country. We stayed out well past curfew. In fact, we were up all night long, and after daybreak we called our grandmother for a ride home. "Excuse me?" she asked. "You disobeyed me, so you may as well start walking." Roger that. She lived 10 miles away, down a long country road, but we joked around and enjoyed ourselves as we started to stroll. Damien lived in Indianapolis, and we were both sagging our baggy jeans and dressed in oversized starter jackets. Not exactly typical gear on Brazil's country roads. We'd walked 7 miles in a few hours when a pickup truck came bouncing down the tarmac in our direction. We edged to the side of the road to let it pass, but it slowed down, and as it crept past us, we could see 2 teenagers in the cab and a third standing in the bed of the truck. The passenger pointed and yelled through his open window, "Niggers!" We didn't overreact. We put our heads down and kept walking at the same pace until we heard that beat-to-shit truck squeal to a stop on a patch of gravel and kick up a dust storm. That's when I turned and saw the passenger, a scruffy-looking redneck, exit the cab of the truck with a pistol in his hand. He aimed it at my head as he stalked toward me. "Where the fuck you from, and why the fuck you here in this fucking town?" Damien eased down the road while I locked eyes with the gunman and said nothing. He stepped within 2 feet of me. The threat of violence doesn't get much more real than that. Chills rippled my skin, but I refused to run or cower. After a few seconds, he got back in the truck and they sped off. It wasn't the first time I'd heard the word. Not long before that, I was hanging out in Pizza Hut with Johnny and a couple of girls, including a brunette I liked named Pam. She liked me too, but we'd never acted on it. We were 2 innocents enjoying one another's company, but when her father arrived to take her home, he caught sight of us, and when Pam saw him, her face went ghost white. He burst into the packed restaurant and stalked towards us with all eyes on him. He never addressed me. He just locked eyes with her and said, "I don't want to ever see you sitting with this nigger again." She hustled out the door after him, her face red with shame as I sat paralyzed, staring at the floor. It was the most humiliating moment of my life, and it hurt much more than the gun incident because it happened in public, and the word had been spewed by a grown-ass man. I couldn't understand how or why he was filled with so much hate, and if he felt that way, how many other people in Brazil shared his point of view when they saw me walking down the street? It was the sort of riddle you didn't want to solve. They won't call on me if they can't see me. That was how I operated during my sophomore year in high school in Brazil, Indiana. I would hide out in the back rows, slump low in my chair, and sidestep my way through each and every class. Our high school made us take a foreign language that year, which was funny to me. Not because I couldn't see the value, but because I could barely read English, let alone understand Spanish. By then, after a good 8 years of cheating, my ignorance had crystallized. I kept leveling up in school, on track, but hadn't learned a damn thing. I was one of those kids who thought he was gaming the system when, the whole time, I'd been gaming myself. One morning, about halfway through the school year, I milled into Spanish class and grabbed my workbook from a back cupboard. There was technique involved in skating by. You didn't have to pay attention, but you did have to make it seem like you were. So I slumped into my seat, opened up my workbook, and fixed my gaze on the teacher who lectured from the front of the room. When I looked down at the page, the whole room went silent. at least to me. Her lips were still moving, but I couldn't hear, because my attention had narrowed on the message left for me, and me alone. We each had our own assigned workbook in that class, and my name was written in pencil at the top right corner of the title page. That's how they knew it was mine. Below that, someone had drawn an image of me in a noose. It looked rudimentary, like something out of the hangman game we used to play as kids. Below that were the words, "Nigger, we're gonna kill you." They'd misspelled it, but I had no clue. I could barely spell myself, and they'd made their fucking point. I looked around the room as my rage gathered like a typhoon until it was literally buzzing in my ears. I'm not supposed to be here, I thought to myself. I'm not supposed to be back in Brazil. I took inventory of all the incidents I'd already experienced and decided I couldn't take much more. The teacher was still talking when I rose up without warning. She called my name, but I wasn't trying to hear. I left the classroom, notebook in hand, and bolted to the principal's office. I was so enraged I didn't even stop at the front desk. I walked right into his office and dropped the evidence on his desk. "I'm tired of this shit," I said. Kirk Freeman was the principal at that time, and to this day he still remembers looking up from his desk and seeing tears in my eyes. It wasn't some mystery why all this shit was happening in Brazil. Southern Indiana had always been a hotbed of racist, and he knew it. 4 years later, in 1995, the Ku Klux Klan would march down Brazil's main drag on Independence Day, in full hooded regalia. The KKK was active in Centerpoint, a town located not 15 minutes away, and kids from there went to our school. Some of them sat behind me in history class and told racist jokes for my benefit nearly every damn day. I wasn't expecting some investigation into who did it. More than anything, in that moment, I was looking for some compassion. And I could tell from the look in the Principal Freeman's eyes he felt bad about what I was going through, but he was at a loss. He didn't know how to help me. Instead, he examined the drawing and the message for a long beat, then raised his eyes to mine, ready to console me with his words of wisdom. "David, this is sheer ignorance," he said. "They don't even know how to spell nigger." My life had been threatened, and that was the best he could do. The loneliness I felt leaving his office is something I'll never forget. It was scary to think that there was so much hate flowing through the halls and that someone I didn't even know wanted me dead because of the color of my skin. The same question kept looping through my mind. Who the fuck is out here who hates me like this? I had no idea who my enemy was. Was it one of the rednecks from history class? Or was it somebody I thought I was cool with but who really didn't like me at all? It was one thing staring down the barrel of a gun on the street or dealing with some racist parent. At least that shit was honest. Wondering who else felt that way in my school was a different kind of unnerving, and I couldn't shake it off. Even though I had plenty of friends, all of them white, I couldn't stop seeing the hidden racism scrawled all over the walls in invisible ink, which made it extremely hard to carry the weight of being the only. It's tough, for me to read this. It's almost me saying the word doesn't even feel right because
Right.
because it's not for me to say.
Right.
And to feel it, it's difficult even for me to read it. I can't even imagine you having to go through it.
Well, the thing about it is there was two different people when I was going through high school, especially in high school. No one knew about any of this stuff. It wasn't like I walked around and said, woe is me, feel sorry for me. I didn't tell anybody anything. I told Kurt Freeman, who was the principal, and, most people didn't know, like what I was going through, what I was dealing with, because I was trying to be so cool. I didn't want to be the kid that was, secretly being bullied. Those kids aren't looked at as cool.
Right.
They're looked at as, you're just a little punk kid. So I was keeping up this big front, sagging my pants, wearing big coats, making up hairstyles, whatever the hell I was doing. But inside, I was broken.
Yeah.
Inside, I didn't want to go home and tell my mom how bad things were because, she was working tons of jobs and trying to make ends meet for us. And once again, my whole thing was protect your mom. Protect your mom. I'd rather me suffer than to see her how bad my life was.
So you couldn't share it with her. You're not going to share it with your friends because you don't want them thinking of you as some charity case.
Right.
So you had to care, and the principal couldn't help you because he just was basically intimidated by the whole thing.
Right.
And it was up to you to kind of, you ended up internalizing it.
And what's funny about all that is when I went to the principal's office, I actually just left Spanish class. I didn't ask for permission. As you read it there, I just got my book, my workbook, and walked right out. Walked down the hallway, and once I talked to Kurt Freeman, I just walked back in class. You know, I think maybe the teacher asked me what was wrong. I probably lied to her. You know, I became a really good liar at this time in my life. You know, I didn't want anybody knowing who the hell I really was. So it was just, you know, you hide all those insecurities, man. You hide everything going wrong with you because, like I said, there was two parts to David Goggins, and what I wanted people to see was I'm some tough guy that nothing could hurt me. But shit was fucking me up in a major way.
Most, if not all, minorities, women and gay people in America, know that strain of loneliness well, of walking into rooms where you are the only one of your kind. Most white men have no idea how hard it can be. I wish they did, because then they'd know how it drains you. How some days all you want to do is stay home and wallow because to go public is to be completely exposed, vulnerable to a world that tracks and judges you. At least that's how it feels. The truth is, you can't tell for sure when or if that is actually happening in a given moment. But it often feels like it, which is its own kind of mindfuck. In Brazil, I was the only everywhere I went. At my table in the cafeteria, where I chilled at lunch with Johnny and our crew, in every class I took, even in the damn basketball gym. By the end of that year, I turned 16, and my grandfather bought me a used doo-doo brown Chevy Citation. One of the first mornings I ever drove it to school, someone spray-painted the word nigger on my driver's side door. This time they spelled it correctly, and Principal Freeman was again at a loss for words. The fury that churned within me that day was indescribable, but it didn't radiate out. It broke me down from within, because I hadn't yet learned what to do or where to channel that much emotion. Was I supposed to fight everybody? I'd been suspended from school 3 times for fighting, and by now I was almost numb. Instead, I withdrew and fell into the well of black nationalism. Malcolm X became my prophet of choice. I used to come home from school and watch the same video of one of his early speeches every damn day. I was trying to find comfort somewhere, and the way he analyzed history and spun black hopelessness into rage nourished me, though most of his political and economic philosophies went over my head. It was his anger at a system made by and for white people that I connected with, because I lived in a haze of hate, trapped in my own fruitless rage and ignorance. But I wasn't Nation of Islam material. That shit took discipline, and I had none of that. Instead, by my junior year, I went out of my way to piss people off by becoming the exact stereotype racist white people loathed and feared. I wore my pants down below my ass every day. I ghetto-wired my car stereo to house speakers which filled the trunk of my Citation. I rattled windows when I cruised down Brazil's main drag, blasting Snoop's Gin and Juice. I put 3 of those shag carpet covers over my steering wheel and dangled a pair of fuzzy dice from the rear view. Every morning before school, I stared into our bathroom mirror and came up with new ways to fuck with the racists at my school. I even concocted wild hairdos. Once I gave myself a reverse part, shaving away all my hair save a thin radial line on the left side of my scalp. It wasn't that I was unpopular. I was considered the cool black kid in town, but if you'd have bothered to drill down a little deeper, you'd see that I wasn't about black culture, and that my antics weren't really trying to call out racism. I wasn't about anything at all. Everything I did was to get a reaction out of the people who hated me most, because everyone's opinion of me mattered to me, and that's a shallow way to live. I was full of pain, had no real purpose, and if you were watching from afar, it would have looked like I'd given up on any chance of success, that I was heading for disaster. But I hadn't let go of all hope. I had one more dream left. I wanted to join the Air Force. My grandfather had been a cook in the Air Force for 37 years, and he was so proud of his service that even after he retired, he'd wear his dress uniform to church on Sundays, and his workaday uniform midweek, just to sit on the damn porch. That level of pride inspired me to join the Civil Air Patrol, the civilian auxiliary of the Air Force. We met once a week, marched in formation, and learned about the various jobs available in the Air Force from officers, which is how I became fascinated with pararescue, the guys who jump out of airplanes to pull downed pilots out of harm's way. I attended a week-long course during the summer before my freshman year called PJOC, the Pararescue Jump Orientation Course. As usual, I was the only. One day, a pararescueman named Scott Guerin came to speak, and he had a motherfucker of a story to tell. During a standard exercise on a high-altitude jump from 13,000 feet, Guerin deployed his chute with another skydiver right above him. That wasn't out of the ordinary. He had the right of way, and per his training, he'd waved off the other jumper. Except the guy didn't see him, which placed Guerin in grave danger because the jumper above him was still mid-freefall, hurtling through the air at over 120 miles per hour. He went into a cannonball, hoping to avoid clipping Guerin, but it didn't work. Guerin had no clue what was coming when his teammate flew through his canopy, collapsing it on contact, and slammed into Guerin's face with his knees. Guerin was knocked unconscious instantly and wobbled into another freefall, his crushed chute creating very little drag. The other skydiver was able to deploy his chute and survive with minor injuries. Guerin didn't really land. He bounced like a flat basketball 3 times, but because he'd been unconscious, his body was limp, and he didn't come apart despite crashing to the ground at 100 miles per hour. He died twice on the operating table, but the ER docs brought him back to life. When he woke in a hospital bed, they said he wouldn't make a full recovery and would never be a pararescueman again. 18 months later, he defied medical odds, made that full recovery, and was back on the job he loved. David. Scott Guerin.
Yeah, this guy right here was a fucking badass, especially for a young kid who was just looking for anything to sink his hands in that gave me some hope. So I was at this PGLC camp, and basically how he was introduced was this guy named Bill Burton, who's now dead. He was a pararescueman also. Bill Burton gave this guy an introduction. He said, "Hey, I want you all to, kind of stand up and put your hands together for Scott Guerin." And when this guy came out, when Scott came out, the first thing I noticed was his throat. His throat had been cut open to get an open airway from his accident. So I will get to that in a little bit. But when Scott came out, he sounded just like Clint Eastwood, because, they had messed up his throat so bad, and he was telling this story. And so he went on telling this story. So for 7 days, man, I would literally sit outside my tent, and this guy would come out of his little hut, and he would do push-ups and sit-ups and flutter kicks all day long. So I became obsessed with Scott Guerin.
Did he look fucked up aside from his throat?
No, he didn't look fucked up at all. He looked like a daggone Greek god. And so I became obsessed with Scott Guerin. So we leave the pararescue or the PGLC training, and I go back home, and I keep thinking about this guy. And this is before, Google and all that shit where you can find somebody. So we had no money. So I go on this hunt for Scott Guerin. And I'm literally Googling, or not Googling, but calling all these Air Force bases. Hey, are there any pararescuemen there? No. So there's very few bases that have pararescuemen. So I finally locate a base, and I'm like, hey, pararescuemen, yes. So then I'm tied into now all the PJs, all the pararescuemen. So I start getting a little bit of traction. So long story short, man, I spent over $500 on a phone bill trying to track this guy down.
You were wearing out 411, huh?
Oh my God, it was unbelievable. So I tracked the guy down, and I leave him a message, and he actually calls me, but my mom answers the phone, and she's like, "Oh my God, like my son's gonna lose his mind." And he's like, "Who the hell is your son?" And my mom's like, "He was like the only black guy in PJ training, in pararescue training." So, to cut to the chase, I go stay with this guy for like 2 weeks. So I'm like begging him, "Can I please come stay with you?" Now, I know the guy for a week. We never had any interaction. I'm begging this guy to come live with him for a week. So he was a scuba instructor in Key West, Florida, at the Special Forces Scuba School. So I go down and stay with him for 2 weeks. And while I'm down there, he's telling me the stories about how this kind of parachute accident happened. So his parachute accident, it's all true how it went down. But the day before the parachute accident, he was actually teaching 2 Navy SEALs who were not medics. He was teaching these 2 guys on how to cut the throat to open up an airway if something happened. So Scott and these guys go for a parachute jump. The guy goes through his parachute, knocked Scott unconscious, as you all have just heard. He hit the ground, bounced twice, and the Navy SEALs that he just taught the day before, they land on the ground, go over to Scott, and actually open his airway. So if Scott didn't teach these guys how to open up an airway, Scott would be dead today.
That's amazing.
It's truly amazing.
That's an amazing story. And that's why you audiobook listeners are stoked, because you are getting the annotated version of this amazing book.
Right. It's just too much to put in the actual book, man. So, I can go on and kind of freestyle some of this stuff.
Amazing stuff. And so for years, you were obsessed with Scott's story and kind of changed your life after meeting him.
Yeah, it changed my life. But, I kind of went back to my old ways.
Yeah.
And, but as you all hear here pretty soon, I went back to my old ways. But, yeah, he was just, just that person that was like, it is possible. There was a real live Rambo out there. So it gave me some hope.
For years, I was obsessed with that story because he'd survived the impossible, and I resonated with his survival. After Wilmoth's murder, with all those racist taunts raining down on my head, I won't bore you with every single episode. Just know there were many more. I felt like I was free-falling with no fucking chute. Guerin was living proof that it's possible to transcend anything that doesn't kill you. And from the time I heard him speak, I knew I would enlist in the Air Force after graduation, which only made school seem more irrelevant. Especially after I was cut from the varsity basketball team during my junior year. I wasn't cut because of my skills. The coaches knew I was one of the best players they had, and that I loved the game. Johnny and I played it night and day. Our entire friendship was based on basketball. But because I was angry at the coaches for how they used me on the JV team the year before, I didn't attend summer workouts, and they took that as a lack of commitment to the team. They didn't know or care that when they cut me, they'd eliminated any incentive I'd had to keep my GPA up, which I'd barely managed to do through cheating anyway. Now I had no good reason to attend school. At least that's what I thought, because I was clueless about the emphasis that the military places on education. I figured they'd take anybody. 2 incidents convinced me otherwise and inspired me to change. The first was when I failed the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test, ASVAB, during my junior year. The ASVAB is the Armed Forces version of the SATs. It's a standardized test that allows the military to assess your current knowledge and future potential for learning at the same time, and I showed up for that test prepared to do what I did best: cheat. I'd been copying on every test in every class for years, but when I took my seat for the ASVAB, I was shocked to see that the people seated to my right and left had different tests than I did. I had to go it alone and scored a 20 out of a possible 99 points. The absolute minimum standard to be admitted to the Air Force is only 36, and I couldn't even get there. The second sign that I needed to change arrived with a postmark just before school let out for the summer after junior year. My mother was still in her emotional black hole after Wilmoth's murder, and her coping mechanism was to take on as much as possible. She worked full-time at DePaul University and taught night classes at Indiana State University, because if she stopped hustling long enough to think, she would realize the reality of her life. She kept it moving, was never around, and never asked to see my grades. After the first semester of our junior year, I remember Johnny and me bringing home F's and D's. We spent 2 hours doctoring the ink. We turned F's into B's and D's into C's, and were laughing the whole damn time. I actually remember feeling a perverse pride in being able to show my fake grades to my mother, but she never even asked to see them. She took my damn word for it. We lived parallel lives in the same house, and since I was more or less raising myself, I stopped listening to her. In fact, about 10 days before the letter arrived, she'd kicked me out because I refused to come home from a party before curfew. She told me that if I didn't, I shouldn't come home at all. In my mind, I had already been living by myself for several years. I made my own meals, cleaned my own clothes. I wasn't angry at her. I was cocky and figured I didn't need her anymore. I stayed out that night, and for the next week and a half I crashed at Johnny's place or with other friends. Eventually the day came when I'd spent my last dollar. By chance, she called me at Johnny's that morning and told me about a letter from school. It said I'd missed over a quarter of the year due to unexcused absences, that I had a D average, and unless I showed significant improvement in my GPA and attendance during my senior year, I would not graduate. She wasn't emotional about it. She was more exhausted than exasperated. "I'll come home and get the note," I said. No need for that, she replied. I just wanted you to know that you were flunking out. I showed up on her doorstep later that day with my stomach growling. I didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't demand an apology. She just left the door open and walked away. I stepped into the kitchen and made myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She passed me the letter without saying a word. I read it in my room, where the walls were papered over with layers of Michael Jordan and special ops posters. Inspiration for twin passions slipping through my fingers. That night, after taking a shower, I wiped the steam away from our corroded bathroom mirror and took a good look. I didn't like who I saw staring back. I was a low-budget thug with no purpose and no future. I felt so disgusted, I wanted to punch that motherfucker in the face and shatter glass. Instead, I lectured him. It was time to get real. Look at you, I said. Why do you think the Air Force wants your punk ass? You stand for nothing? You are an embarrassment. I reached for the shaving cream, smoothed the thin coat over my face, unwrapped a fresh razor, and kept talking as I shaved. You are one dumb motherfucker. You read like a third grader. You're a fucking joke. You've never tried hard at anything in your life besides basketball, and you have goals? That's fucking hilarious. After shaving peach fuzz from my cheeks and chin, I lathered up my scalp. I was desperate for a change. I wanted to become someone new. You don't see people in the military sagging their pants. You need to stop talking like a wannabe gangster. None of this shit is gonna cut it. No more taking the easy way out. It's time to grow the fuck up. Steam billowed all around me. It rippled off my skin and poured from my soul. What started as a spontaneous venting session had become a solo intervention. It's on you, I said. Yeah, I know shit is fucked up. I know what you've been through. I was there, bitch. Merry fucking Christmas. Nobody is coming to save your ass. Not your mommy, not Wilmoth, nobody. It's up to you. By the time I was done talking, I was shaved clean. Water purled on my scalp, streamed from my forehead, and dripped down the bridge of my nose. I looked different, and for the first time, I'd held myself accountable. A new ritual was born, one that stayed with me for years. It would help me get my grades up, whip my sorry ass into shape, and see me through graduation and into the Air Force. The ritual was simple. I'd shave my face and scalp every night, get loud, and get real. I set goals, wrote them on Post-it notes, and tagged them to what I now call the accountability mirror, because each day I'd hold myself accountable to the goals I'd set. At first, my goals involved shaping up my appearance and accomplishing all my chores without having to be asked. Make your bed like you're in the military every day. Pull up your pants. Shave your head every morning. Cut the grass. Wash all dishes. The accountability mirror kept me on point from then on, and though I was still young when this strategy came through me, since then I found it useful for people at any stage in life. You could be on the cusp of retirement, looking to reinvent yourself. Maybe you're going through a bad breakup or have gained weight. Perhaps you're permanently disabled, overcoming some other injury, or are just coming to grips with how much of your life you've wasted living without purpose. In each case, that negativity you're feeling is your internal desire for change, but change doesn't come easy, and the reason this ritual worked so well for me was because of my tone. I wasn't fluffy. I was raw, because that was the only way to get myself right. That summer between my junior and senior year in high school, I was afraid. I was insecure. I wasn't a smart kid. I'd blown off all accountability for my entire teenage existence, and actually thought I was getting over on all the adults in my life, getting over on the system. I duped myself into a negative feedback loop of cheating and scamming that on the surface looked like advancement until I hit a brick fucking wall called reality. That night when I came home and read the letter from my school, there was no denying the truth, and I delivered it hard. I didn't dance around and say, "Geez, David, you are not taking your education very seriously." No, I had to own it in the raw, because the only way we can change is to be real with ourselves. If you don't know shit and have never taken school seriously, then say, "I'm dumb." Tell yourself that you need to get your ass to work because you're falling behind in life. If you look in the mirror and you see a fat person, don't tell yourself that you need to lose a couple of pounds. Tell the truth. You're fucking fat. It's okay. Just say you're fat if you're fat. The dirty mirror that you see every day is going to tell you the truth every time. So why are you still lying to yourself? So you can feel better for a few minutes and stay the fucking same? If you're fat, you need to change the fact that you're fat because it's very fucking unhealthy. I know because I've been there. If you have worked for 30 years doing the same shit you've hated day in and day out because you are afraid to quit and take a risk, you've been living like a pussy. Period. Point blank. Tell yourself the truth, that you've wasted enough time, and that you have other dreams that will take courage to realize, so you don't die a fucking pussy. Call yourself out. Nobody likes to hear the hard truth. Individually and as a culture, we avoid what we need to hear most. This world is fucked up. There are major problems in our society. We are still dividing ourselves up along racial and cultural lines, and people don't have the balls to hear it. The truth is, racism and bigotry still fucking exist, and some people are so thin-skinned they refuse to admit that. To this day, many in Brazil claim that there is no racism in their small town. That's why I have to give Kirk Freeman props. When I called him in the spring of 2018, he remembered what I went through very clearly. He's one of the few who isn't afraid of the truth. But if you are the only, and you aren't stuck in some real-world genocidal twilight zone, you'd better get real too. Your life is not fucked up because of overt racist or hidden systemic racism. You aren't missing out on opportunities, making shit money, and getting evicted because of America or Donald fucking Trump, or because your ancestors were slaves, or because some people hate immigrants or Jews or harass women or believe gay people are going to hell. If any of that shit is stopping you from excelling in life, I've got some news. You are stopping you. You are giving up instead of getting hard. Tell the truth about the real reasons for your limitations, and you will turn that negativity, which is real, into jet fuel. Those odds stacked against you will become a damn runway. There is no more time to waste. Hours and days evaporate like creeks in the desert. That's why it's okay to be cruel to yourself, as long as you realize you're doing it to become better. We all need thicker skin to improve in life. Being soft when you look in the mirror isn't going to inspire the wholesale changes we need to shift our present and open up our future. The morning after that first session with the accountability mirror, I trashed the shag steering wheel and the fuzzy dice. I tucked my shirt in and wore my pants with a belt, and once school started up again, I stopped eating at my lunch table. For the first time, being liked and acting cool were a waste of my time, and instead of eating with all the popular kids, I found my own table and ate alone. Mind you, the rest of my progress could not be described as a blink-and-you'll-miss-it metamorphosis. Lady Luck did not suddenly show up, run me a hot, soapy bath, and kiss me like she loved me. In fact, the only reason I didn't become just another statistic is because at the last possible moment, I got to work. During my senior year in high school, all I cared about was working out, playing basketball, and studying, and it was the accountability mirror that kept me motivated to keep pushing towards something better. I woke up before dawn and started going to the YMCA most mornings at 5 a.m., before school to hit the weights. I ran all the damn time, usually around the local golf course after dark. One night I ran 13 miles, the most I'd ever run in my entire life. On that run, I came to a familiar intersection. It was the same street where that redneck had pulled a gun on me. I avoided it and ran on, covering a half mile in the opposite direction before something told me to turn back. When I arrived at that intersection a second time, I stopped and contemplated it. I was scared shitless of that street. My heart was leaping from my chest, which is exactly why I suddenly started charging down its fucking throat. Within seconds, 2 snarling dogs got loose and chased me as the woods leaned in on both sides. It was all I could do to stay a step ahead of the beasts. I kept expecting that truck to reappear and run me the fuck down like some scene from Mississippi circa 1965, but I kept running, faster and faster until I was breathless. Eventually the hounds of hell gave up and loped off, and it was just me, the rhythm and steam of my breath, and that deep country quiet. It was cleansing. By the time I turned back, my fear was gone. I owned that fucking street. From then on, I brainwashed myself into craving discomfort. If it was raining, I would go run. Whenever it started snowing, my mind would say, "Get your fucking running shoes on." Sometimes I wussed out and had to deal with it at the accountability mirror. But facing that mirror, facing myself, motivated me to fight through uncomfortable experiences, and as a result, I became tougher, and being tough and resilient helped me meet my goals. Nothing was as hard for me as learning. The kitchen table became my all-day, all-night study hall. After I'd failed the ASVAB a second time, my mother realized that I was serious about the Air Force, so she found me a tutor who helped me figure out a system I could use to learn. That system was memorization. I couldn't learn just by scratching a few notes and memorizing those. I had to read a textbook and write each page down in my notebook, then do it again a second and third time. That's how knowledge stuck to the mirror of my mind, not through learning, but through transcription, memorization, and recall. I did that for English. I did that for history. I wrote out and memorized formulas for algebra. If my tutor took an hour to teach me a lesson, I had to go back over my notes from that session for 6 hours to lock it in. My personal study hall schedule and goals became post-it notes on my accountability mirror. And guess what happened? I developed an obsession for learning. Over 6 months, I went from having a 4th grade reading level to that of a senior in high school. My vocabulary mushroomed. I wrote out thousands of flashcards and went over them for hours, days, and weeks. I did the same for mathematical formulas. Part of it was survival instinct. I damn sure wasn't going to get into college based on academics, and though I was a starter on the varsity basketball team my senior year, no college scouts knew my name. All I knew was that I had to get the fuck out of Brazil, Indiana, that the military was my best chance, and to get there I had to pass the ASVAB. On my 3rd try, I met the minimum standard for the Air Force. Living with purpose changed everything for me, at least in the short term. During my senior year in high school, studying and working out gave my mind so much energy that hate flaked from my soul like used-up snakeskin. The resentment I held toward the racists in Brazil, the emotion that had dominated me and was burning me up inside, dissipated because I'd finally considered the fucking source. I looked at the people who were making me feel uncomfortable and realized how uncomfortable they were in their own skin. To make fun of or try to intimidate someone they didn't even know based on race alone was a clear indication that something was very wrong with them, not me. But when you have no confidence, it becomes easy to value other people's opinions, and I was valuing everyone's opinion without considering the minds that generated them. That sounds silly, but it's an easy trap to fall into, especially when you are insecure on top of being the only. As soon as I made that connection, being upset with them was not worth my time, because if I was going to kick their ass in life, and I was, I had way too much shit to do. Each insult or dismissive gesture became more fuel for the engine revving inside me. By the time I graduated, I knew that the confidence I'd managed to develop didn't come from a perfect family or God-given talent. It came from personal accountability, which brought me self-respect, and self-respect will always light a way forward. For me, it lit up a path straight out of Brazil, forever. But I didn't get away clean. When you transcend a place and time that has challenged you to the core, it can feel like you've won a war. Don't fall for that mirage. Your past, your deepest fears, have a way of going dormant before springing back to life at double strength. You must remain vigilant. For me, the Air Force revealed that I was still soft inside. I was still insecure. I wasn't yet hard of bone and mind. This is a good principle, the accountability mirror.
Yes, man, the accountability mirror is something that started it all for me. And it was so much easier to be someone else. That's why, acting like I was cool, acting like a wannabe thug, sagging my pants. I was just living a dream world. Let's not be David Goggins. Let's just be this funny looking character that's not dealing with his own problems. So it made my life so much easier to not deal with this fucked up life that I had.
But at the same time, I could see how you'd do it. Like you were kind of thriving. The comedy aspect of it does help you deal with it to some sense. It almost like was a painkiller. The comedy aspect of it, right?
Oh yeah, It you know what's funny? It's it's the honest truth what you say. But the scary thing about it is you accomplish nothing.
Right.
Nothing gets accomplished. So yeah, it helped me kind of get by.
Yeah.
But that's all I was doing was getting by. And I was afraid. I was really afraid to go back in that pile of shit. And by 18, 19 years old, I already had so much crap that I had to go through. I just kept putting it off. And the scary thing about it was I always knew that I had it in me. I always knew I had it in me to learn. I always knew I had it in me to be better. But I knew that it was going to take me so many more hours than the normal person. I knew that I was coming into the game at such a deficit. And, I didn't have these great parents. I didn't have this great foundation. So I had to almost by myself start rebuilding the house. And I knew what kind of work that was going to take for me to do this. So I just kept running away from the work.
What made you decide that it was the Post-it notes? Because at first I could see you talking to yourself in the mirror and it becoming like its own trance.
Right.
But how did you decide to go to the Post-it notes and start to actually make them kind of work detail?
So what was crazy about it is that my mind, the way it works, is if I don't have constant reminders, I will, your path is, like, your mind is constantly looking for the path of least resistance. So if you're not constantly challenging yourself every day, for a person like me, if I'm not constantly looking at, okay, the task at hand today on my post-it notes on this mirror is to do this, my mind's going to say, hey, let's not do that today. Let's go over here, go to Johnny's house, play basketball, and just fuck around. So I had to have a constant reminder of, hey, all right, David, we have to do X, Y, and Z today, or we can't do this and that. So I had to earn everything in my life from that point forward.
I remember Johnny, when we talked to Johnny, saying that it was almost like you just disappeared. Like he wanted to play basketball and you'd be at the kitchen table studying because you hadn't knocked it out yet.
You know what's funny about that, man? I didn't pick up a basketball. So this happened my junior year, and then my senior year, I played basketball. I didn't pick up a basketball for about 20 years.
Really?
Yep. And that's something I don't tell anybody. So basketball was my love. But I realized that basketball became my escape. And I no longer could escape from my life. So I started choosing whatever made me uncomfortable. I realized that I had to start gravitating towards that. And it was a long process. It wasn't like I woke up one morning, looked in the accountability mirror and figured out, oh, let me write some post-it notes down here and start doing this. We all have a voice in our head. We all have a voice in our head that is trying to direct you to a place where you can be better. We also have another voice in our head that's saying, fuck that, let's not do that. So whatever that voice was saying that kind of sucked, that sucky voice that made me very uncomfortable, I started realizing that that's the only voice I can listen to. The other voice was a voice of comfort. And I had to stop listening to that voice because it always took me down the path of least resistance.
So this challenge that we set up is for your readers and listeners to set up their own accountability mirror.
Right.
And you've never really laid out that challenge to your followers before, have you?
No, this is something brand new. I've never even, well, I talk about the accountability mirror every now and then, but this is definitely brand new.
Where you're breaking out like how-tos about it.
Exactly.
Challenge number 2, it's time to come eyeball to eyeball with yourself and get raw and real. This is not a self-love tactic. You can't fluff it. Don't massage your ego. This is about abolishing the ego and taking the first step toward becoming the real you. I tack post-it notes on my accountability mirror, and I'll ask you to do the same. Digital devices won't work. Write all your insecurities, dreams, and goals on post-its and tag up your mirror. If you need more education, remind yourself that you need to start working your ass off because you aren't smart enough. Period. Point blank. If you look in the mirror and see someone who is obviously overweight, that means you're fucking fat. Own it. It's okay to be unkind with yourself in these moments because we need thicker skin to improve in life. Whether it's a career goal, quit my job, start a business, a lifestyle goal, lose weight and get more active, or an athletic one, run my first 5K, 10K, or marathon, you need to be truthful with yourself about where you are and the necessary steps it will take to achieve those goals, day by day. Each step, each necessary point of self-improvement should be written as its own note. That means you have to do some research and break it all down. For example, if you're trying to lose 40 pounds, your first post-it may be to lose 2 pounds in the first week. Once that goal is achieved, remove the note and post the next goal of 2 to 5 pounds until your ultimate goal is realized. Whatever your goal, you'll need to hold yourself accountable for the small steps it will take to get there. Self-improvement takes dedication and self-discipline. The dirty mirror you see every day is going to reveal the truth. Stop ignoring it. Use it to your advantage. If you feel it, post an image of yourself staring into your tagged up accountability mirror on social media with the hashtags #Can'tHurtMe, #accountabilitymirror. Talk about the tone and what it means to have thicker skin and why that's so important.
You know, we live in a world nowadays, especially now, we live in a soft generation, man. People are very soft, and people hate to admit that they're wrong. They hate to admit that they're wrong. Like, I mean, even for very simple things, it's much easier to blame somebody. People, that whole accountability thing, it sounds so simple. But how many times do you sit in a room when somebody messes up and no one really says, hey, I messed up. Hey, I apologize, I messed up. That's one of the hardest things to do. So that whole thick skin is to be able to take criticism, be able to criticize yourself. Why? We live in this society and we believe that everybody is so great and so perfect, but we haven't really realized that everybody's fucked up. Everybody's fucked up, even the people who are judging you. All that they're doing better than you is they're hiding. They're able to hide better than you are. So they make you feel like you're a piece of shit because they don't want to hold themselves accountable. So the whole thick skin thing is, whatever you are, own it. The only way you're going to lose weight is to say, hey, I'm overweight. I'm fat. You might be obese. The only way you're going to fix being smarter is say, you know what? I'm not the smartest cat in the world. I need to fix these things that I'm lacking in. And that's the only way I got better, was to develop thick skin. You know, back in the day, somebody would have called me dumb. You know, yeah, it hurts your feelings, but are you dumb? Are you dumb? Yeah, it's hurtful. It hurts your feelings. Yeah, no one wants to hear it. But sometimes bullies are just telling you the fucking truth in a very mean way. And that's how you got to look at it. You got to look at, you know what, man? I'm not the smartest cat in the world. But use that strength. Use, like, you know, if you're getting bullied in a way, if they're calling you fat, don't go home and put your head down. Go home and say, you know what, I am fat, but I'm going to lose some fucking weight and go back to school or go back to whatever and say, hey, look at me now. Take a different vantage point in life. Don't look at it as always being hurt. Grow that thick skin. Grow daggone alligator skin to where nothing can hurt you. Not thick skin, grow alligator skin. And that's right there where you start getting the tactical advantage over everything, over yourself. Like I said before, your mind is always at the tactical advantage. It knows your fears. It knows your insecurities. You can't outrun them. So you might as well face them, hold yourself accountable, and then start to fix them.
Yeah, it's like in these days, everyone wants to sit in their feelings and have their feelings validated. Like, this is my emotional process, this is that. But what you're saying is, you know, there's a lot more to what you feel. You can't believe everything you feel.
Right.
And sometimes you have to go deeper and find your way out of the feeling.
Right. And even deeper than that is that a lot of people start to hang around people that, you know, allow them to have no accountability. You know, they have friends that say, oh yeah, it's their fault. They start to tell you everything you want to hear. And that's how you group your friends. You got that run friend that comes in there and says, hey man, no, you're kind of fucked up. You need to change your way. You no longer want to hang with that person.
Yeah.
So, you know, we got to look at, so this is all encompassing about everything you do in life. Pick the people around you that are going to hold you to a higher standard, not a lower standard that makes you feel better.
I like it. I think that's one of the biggest problems in society is that people are afraid to hear what they don't want to hear. And it makes us all worse off.
100%, man. And especially nowadays,
Yeah.
It's a much kinder, gentler world where everybody's winning. And at the end of the day, all you're doing is losing.
Chapter 3, The Impossible Task. It was past midnight and the streets were dead. I steered my pickup truck into another empty parking lot and killed the engine. In the quiet, all I could hear were the eerie halogen hum of the street lamps and the scratch of my pen as I checked off another franchise feed trough. The latest in a never-ending series of fast food and dine-in industrial kitchens that receive more nightly visitors than you'd care to know about. That's why guys like me showed up to places like this in the wee hours. I stuffed my clipboard under the armrest, grabbed my gear, and began restocking rat traps. They're everywhere, those little green boxes. Look around almost any restaurant and you'll find them, hidden in plain sight. My job was to bait, move, or replace them. Sometimes I hit pay dirt and found a rat carcass, which never caught me by surprise. You know death when you smell it. This wasn't the mission I signed up for when I enlisted in the Air Force with dreams of joining a pararescue unit. Back then I was 19 years old and weighed 175 pounds. By the time I was discharged 4 years later, I had ballooned to nearly 300 pounds and was on a different kind of patrol. At that weight, even bending down to bait the traps took effort. I was so damn fat I had to sew an athletic sock into the crotch of my work pants so they wouldn't split when I dropped to one knee. No bullshit. I was a sorry fucking sight. With the exterior handled, it was time to venture indoors, which was its own wilderness. I had keys to almost every restaurant in this part of Indianapolis, and their alarm codes too. Once inside, I pumped my hand-held silver canister full of poison and placed a fumigation mask over my face. I looked like a damn space alien in that thing, with its dual filters jutting out from my mouth, protecting me from toxic fumes, protecting me. If there was anything I liked about that job, it was the stealth nature of working late, moving in and out of inky shadows. I loved that mask for the same reason. It was vital, and not because of any damn insecticide. I needed it because it made it impossible for anyone to see me, especially me. Even if by chance I caught my own reflection in a glass doorway or on a stainless steel countertop, it wasn't me I was seeing. It was some janky-ass, low-budget stormtrooper, the kind of guy who would palm yesterday's brownies on his way out the door. It wasn't me. Sometimes I'd see roaches scurry for cover when I flipped the lights on to spray down the counters and the tiled floors. I'd see dead rodents stuck to sticky traps I'd laid on previous visits. I bagged and dumped them. I checked the lighting systems I'd installed to catch moths and flies and clean those out too. Within a half hour I was gone, rolling on to the next restaurant. I had a dozen stops every night and had to hit them all before dawn. Maybe this kind of gig sounds disgusting to you. When I think back, I'm disgusted too. But not because of the job. It was honest work. Necessary. Hell, in Air Force boot camp, I got on the wrong side of my first drill sergeant and she made me the latrine queen. It was my job to keep the latrines in our barracks shining. She told me that if she found one speck of dirt in that latrine at any moment, I would get recycled back to day one and join a new flight. I took my discipline. I was happy just to be in the Air Force, and I cleaned the hell out of that latrine. You could have eaten off that floor. 4 years later, the guy who was so energized by opportunity that he was excited to clean latrines was gone, and I didn't feel anything at all. They say there's always light at the end of the tunnel, but not once your eyes adjust to the darkness, and that's what happened to me. I was numb. Numb to my life, miserable in my marriage, and I'd accepted that reality. I was a would-be warrior turned cockroach sniper on the graveyard shift. Just another zombie selling his time on Earth, going through the motions. In fact, the only insight I had into my job at that time was that it was actually a step up. When I first discharged from the military, I got a job at St. Vincent's Hospital. I worked security from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. for minimum wage and cleared about $700 a month. Every now and then I'd see an Ecolab truck pull up. We were on the exterminator's regular rotation, and it was my job to unlock the hospital kitchen for him. One night we got to talking, and he mentioned that Ecolab was hiring, and that the job came with a free truck and no boss looking over your shoulder. It was also a 35% pay raise. I didn't think about the health risks. I didn't think at all. I was taking what was being offered. I was on that spoon-fed path of least resistance, letting dominoes fall on my head, and it was killing me slowly. But there's a difference between being numb and clueless. In the dark night, there weren't a lot of distractions to get me out of my head, and I knew that I had tipped the first domino. I'd started the chain reaction that put me on Ecolab duty. The Air Force should have been my way out. That first drill sergeant did end up recycling me into a different unit, and in my new flight, I became a star recruit. I was 6'2" and weighed about 175 pounds. I was fast and strong. Our unit was the best flight in all of boot camp, and soon I was training for my dream job, Air Force Pararescue. We were guardian angels with fangs, trained to drop from the sky behind enemy lines and pull down pilots out of harm's way. I was one of the best guys in that training. I was one of the best at push-ups and the best at sit-ups, flutter kicks, and running. I was 1 point behind honor grad, but there was something they didn't talk about in the lead up to pararescue training. Water confidence. That's a nice name for a course where they try to drown your ass for weeks, and I was uncomfortable as hell in the water. Although my mom got us off the public dole and out of subsidized housing within 3 years, she still didn't have extra cash for swim lessons, and we avoided pools. It wasn't until I attended Boy Scout camp when I was 12 years old that I was finally confronted with swimming. Leaving Buffalo allowed me to join the Scouts, and camp was my best opportunity to score all the merit badges I'd need to stay on the path to becoming an Eagle Scout. One morning it was time to qualify for the swimming merit badge, and that meant a 1-mile swim in a lake course marked off with buoys. All the other kids jumped in and started getting after it, and if I wanted to save face, I had to pretend I knew what I was doing. So I followed them into the lake. I dog paddled the best I could, but kept swallowing water, so I flipped onto my back and ended up swimming the entire mile with a fucked up backstroke I'd improvised on the fly. Merit badge secured. When it came time to take the swim test to get into pararescue, I needed to be able to swim for real. This was a timed 500-meter freestyle swim, and even at 19 years old, I didn't know how to swim freestyle. So I took my stunted ass down to Barnes & Noble, bought Swimming for Dummies, studied the diagrams, and practiced in the pool every day. I hated putting my face in the water, but I'd manage for 1 stroke, then 2, and before long, I could swim an entire lap. I wasn't as buoyant as most swimmers. Whenever I stopped swimming, even for a moment, I'd start to sink, which made my heart pound with panic, and my increased tension just made it worse. Eventually, I passed that swim test, but there is a difference between being competent and comfortable in the water. Another big gap from comfortable to confident, and when you can't float like most people, water confidence does not come easy. Sometimes, it doesn't come at all. In pararescue training, water confidence is part of the 10-week program, and it's filled with specific evolutions designed to test how well we perform in the water under stress. One of the worst evolutions for me was called bobbing. The class was divided into groups of 5, lined up from gutter to gutter in the shallow end, and fully kitted up. Our backs were strapped with twin 80-liter tanks made from galvanized steel, and we wore 16-pound weight belts too. We were loaded the fuck down, which would have been fine, except in this evolution, we weren't allowed to breathe from those tanks. Instead, we were told to walk backward, down the slope of the pool, from the 3-foot section to the deep end, about 10 feet down. And on that slow walk into position, my mind swirled with doubt and negativity. What the fuck are you doing here? This isn't for you. You can't swim. You're an imposter, and they will find you out. Time slowed down, and those seconds seemed like minutes. My diaphragm lurched, trying to force air into my lungs. Theoretically, I knew that relaxation was the key to all the underwater evolutions, but I was too terrified to let go. My jaw clenched as tight as my fists. My head throbbed as I worked to stave off panic. Finally, we were all in position, and it was time to start bobbing. That meant pushing up from the bottom to the surface without the benefit of finning, getting a gulp of air, and sinking back down. It wasn't easy getting up fully loaded, but at least I was able to breathe, and that first breath was a salvation. Oxygen flooded my system, and I started to relax until the instructor yelled, "Switch!" That was our cue to take our fins from our feet, place them on our hands, and use one pull with our arms to propel ourselves to the surface. We were allowed to push off the floor of the pool, but we couldn't kick. We did that for 5 minutes. Shallow water and surface blackouts aren't uncommon during water confidence training. It goes along with stressing the body and limiting oxygen intake. With the flippers on my hands, I'd barely get my face high enough out of the water to breathe, and in between, I was working hard and burning oxygen. And when you burn too much too fast, your brain shuts down, and you will black the fuck out. Our instructors called that meeting the wizard. As the clock ticked, I could see stars materializing in my peripheral vision, and felt the wizard creeping close. I passed that evolution, and soon, finning with my arms or feet became easy for me. What stayed hard, from beginning to end, was one of our simplest tasks, treading water without our hands. We had to keep our hands and our chins high above the water, using only our legs, which we'd swirl in a blender-like motion, for 3 minutes. That doesn't sound like much time, and for most of the class it was easy. For me, it was damn near impossible. My chin kept hitting the water, which meant the time would start again from 000. All around me, my classmates were so comfortable, their legs were barely moving, while mine were whirring at top speed, and I still couldn't get half as high as those white boys who looked to be defying gravity. Every day was another humiliation in the pool. Not that I was embarrassed publicly. I passed all the evolutions, but inside I was suffering. Each night I'd fixate on the next day's task, and become so terrified I couldn't sleep. and soon my fear morphed into resentment toward my classmates, who, in my mind, had it easy, which dredged up my past. I was the only black man in my unit, which reminded me of my childhood in rural Indiana, and the harder the water confidence training became, the higher those dark waters would rise, until it seemed I was also being drowned from the inside out. While the rest of my class was sleeping, that potent cocktail of fear and rage thrummed through my veins, and my nocturnal fixations became their own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. One where failure was inevitable, because my unchecked fear was unleashing something I couldn't control, the quitting mind. It all came to a head 6 weeks into the training, with the buddy breathing exercise. We partnered up. Each pair gripped one another by the forearm, and took turns breathing through just one snorkel. Meanwhile, the instructors thrashed us, trying to separate us from our snorkel. All of this was supposed to be happening at or near the surface, but I was negatively buoyant, which meant I was sinking into the middle waters of the deep end, dragging my partner down with me. He'd take a breath and pass the snorkel down to me. I'd swim to the surface, exhale, and attempt to clear the water from our snorkel and get a clean breath before passing it back to him, but the instructors made that almost impossible. I'd usually only clear the tube halfway and inhale more water than air. From the jump, I was operating from an oxygen deficit while fighting to stay near the surface. In military training, it's the instructor's job to identify weak links and challenge them to perform or quit, and they could tell I was struggling. In the pool that day, one of them was always in my face, yelling and thrashing me, while I choked, trying and failing to gulp air through a narrow tube to stave off the wizard. I went under and remember looking up at the rest of the class, splayed out like serene starfish on the surface, calm as can be. They passed their snorkels back and forth with ease, while I fumed. I know now that my instructor was just doing his job, but back then I thought, this fucker's not giving me a fair shot. I passed that evolution too, but I still had 11 more evolutions and 4 more weeks of water confidence training to go. It made sense. We would be jumping out of airplanes over water. We needed it. I just didn't want to do it anymore. And the next morning, I was offered a way out I hadn't seen coming. Weeks earlier, we'd had our blood drawn during a med check, and the doctors had just discovered I carried the sickle cell trait. I didn't have the disease, sickle cell anemia, but I had the trait, which was believed at the time to increase the risk of sudden exercise-related death due to cardiac arrest. The Air Force didn't want me dropping dead in the middle of an evolution and pulled me out of training on a medical. I pretended to take the news hard, as if my dream was being ripped away. I made a big fucking act of being pissed off, but inside, I was ecstatic. Later that week, the doctors reversed their decision. They didn't specifically say it was safe for me to continue, but they said the trait wasn't yet well understood and allowed me to decide for myself. When I reported back to training, the master sergeant informed me that I'd missed too much time and that if I wanted to continue, I would have to start over from day 1, week 1. Instead of less than 4 weeks, I'd have to endure another 10 weeks of the terror, rage, and insomnia that came with water confidence. These days, that kind of thing wouldn't even register on my radar. You tell me to run longer and harder than everyone else just to get a fair shake, I'd say, Roger that, and keep moving. But back then, I was still half-baked. Physically, I was strong, but I was not even close to mastering my mind. The master sergeant stared at me, awaiting my response. I couldn't even look him in the eye when I said, "You know what, Master Sergeant? The doctor doesn't know much about this sickle cell thing, and it's bothering me." He nodded, emotionless, and signed the papers pulling me out of the program for good. He cited sickle cell, and on paper I didn't quit, but I knew the truth. If I had been the guy I am today, I wouldn't have given 2 fucks about sickle cell. I still have the sickle cell trait. You don't just get rid of it. But back then, an obstacle had appeared, and I'd folded. I moved on to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, told my friends and family that I was forced from the program on a medical, and served out my 4 years in the Tactical Air Control Party, TACP, which works with some special operations units. I trained or liaised between ground units and air support, fast movers like F-15s and F-16s, behind enemy lines. It was challenging work with intelligent people, but sadly I was never proud of it, and didn't see the opportunities offered because I knew I was a quitter who had let fear dictate my future. I buried my shame in the gym and at the kitchen table. I got into powerlifting and layered on the mass. I ate and worked out and ate. In my last days in the Air Force, I weighed 255 pounds. After my discharge, I continued to bulk up with both muscle and fat until I weighed nearly 300 pounds. I wanted to be big because being big hid David Goggins. I was able to tuck this 175-pound person into those 21-inch biceps and that flabby belly. I grew a burly mustache and was intimidating to everyone who saw me, but inside I knew I was a pussy, and that's a haunting feeling. The morning I began to take charge of my destiny started out like any other. When the clock struck 7 a.m., my Ecolab shift ended, and I hit the Steak and Shake drive-thru to score a large chocolate milkshake. Next stop, 7-Eleven, for a box of Hostess mini chocolate donuts. I gobbled those on my 45-minute drive home to a beautiful apartment on a golf course in Pretty Carmel, Indiana, which I shared with my wife, Pam, and her daughter. Remember that Pizza Hut incident? I married that girl. I married a girl whose dad called me a nigger. What does that say about me? We couldn't afford that life. Pam wasn't even working, but in those credit card debt-loading days, nothing made much sense. I was doing 70 miles per hour on the highway, mainlining sugar and listening to a local classic rock station when Sound of Silence poured from the stereo. Simon and Garfunkel's words echoed like truth. Darkness was a friend indeed. I worked in the dark, hid my true self from friends and strangers. Nobody would have believed how numb and afraid I was back then because I looked like a beast that no one would dare fuck with. But my mind wasn't right, and my soul was weighed down by too much trauma and failure. I had every excuse in the world to be a loser, and used them all. My life was crumbling, and Pam dealt with that by fleeing the scene. Her parents still lived in Brazil, just 70 miles away. We spent most of our time apart. I arrived home from work around 8 a.m., and the phone rang as soon as I walked in the door. It was my mother. She knew my routine. "Come on over for your staple," she said. My staple was a breakfast buffet for one, the likes of which few could put down in a single sitting. Think 8 Pillsbury cinnamon rolls, a half-dozen scrambled eggs, a half-pound of bacon, and 2 bowls of Fruity Pebbles. Don't forget, I had just decimated a box of donuts and a chocolate shake. I didn't even have to respond. She knew I was coming. Food was my drug of choice, and I always sucked up every last crumb. I hung up, flipped on the television, and stomped down the hall to the shower, where I could hear a narrator's voice filter through the steam. I caught snippets. Navy SEALs, toughest, the world. I wrapped a towel around my waist and rushed back into the living room. I was so big, the towel barely covered my fat ass, but I sat down on the couch and didn't move for 30 minutes. The show followed Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL, BUDS, Training Class 224, through Hell Week, the most arduous series of tasks in the most physically demanding training in the military. I watched men sweat and suffer as they tore through muddy obstacle courses, ran on the soft sand holding logs overhead, and shivered in icy surf. Sweat purled on my scalp. I was literally on the edge of my seat as I saw guys, some of the strongest of them all, ring the bell and quit. Made sense. Only 1/3 of the men who begin BUDS make it through Hell Week. And in all of my time in pararescue training, I couldn't remember feeling as awful as these men looked. They were swollen, chafed, sleep-deprived, and dead on their feet, and I was jealous of them. The longer I watched, the more certain I became that there were answers buried in all that suffering. Answers that I needed. More than once, the camera panned over the endless, frothing ocean, and each time I felt pathetic. The SEALs were everything I wasn't. They were about pride, dignity, and the type of excellence that came from bathing in the fire, getting beat the fuck down, and going back for more, again and again. They were the human equivalent of the hardest, sharpest sword you could imagine. They sought out the flame, took the pounding for as long as necessary, longer even, until they were fearless and deadly. They weren't motivated. They were driven. The show ended with graduation. 22 proud men stood shoulder to shoulder in their dress whites before the camera pushed in on their commanding officer. "In a society where mediocrity is too often the standard and too often rewarded," he said, There is intense fascination with men who detest mediocrity, who refuse to define themselves in conventional terms, and who seek to transcend traditionally recognized human capabilities. This is exactly the type of person Buds is meant to find. The man who finds a way to complete each and every task to the best of his ability. The man who will adapt and overcome any and all obstacles. In that moment, it felt as though the commanding officer was talking directly to me. But after the show ended, I walked back to the bathroom, faced the mirror, and stared myself down. I looked every bit of 300 pounds. I was everything all the haters back home said I would be. Uneducated, with no real-world skills, zero discipline, and a dead-end future. Mediocrity would have been a major promotion. I was at the bottom of the barrel of life, pooling in the dregs. But for the first time in way too long, I was awake. I barely spoke to my mother during breakfast, and only ate half my staple, because my mind was on unfinished business. I'd always wanted to join an elite special operations unit, and beneath all the rolls of flesh and layers of failure, that desire was still there. Now it was coming back to life, thanks to a chance viewing of a show that continued to work on me like a virus moving cell to cell, taking over. It became an obsession I couldn't shake. Every morning after work for almost 3 weeks, I called active duty recruiters in the Navy and told them my story. I called offices all over the country. I said I was willing to move as long as they could get me to SEAL training. Everyone turned me down. Most weren't interested in candidates with prior service. One local recruiting office was intrigued and wanted to meet in person, but when I got there, they laughed in my face. I was way too heavy, and in their eyes, I was just another delusional pretender. I left that meeting feeling the same way. After calling all the active duty recruiting offices I could find, I dialed the local unit of the Naval Reserves and spoke to Petty Officer Stephen Shaljo for the first time. Shaljo had worked with multiple F-14 squadrons as an electrician and instructor at NAS Miramar for 8 years before joining the recruitment staff in San Diego, where the SEALs train. He worked day and night and rose quickly in the ranks. His move to Indianapolis came with a promotion and the challenge of finding Navy recruits in the middle of the corn. He'd only been on the job in Indy for 10 days by the time I called, and if I'd reached anyone else, you probably wouldn't be listening to this book. But through a combination of dumb luck and stubborn persistence, I found one of the finest recruiters in the Navy, a guy whose favorite task was discovering diamonds in the rough. Prior service guys like me who were looking to re-enlist and hoping to land in special operations. Our initial conversation didn't last long. He said he could help me and that I should come in to meet in person. That sounded familiar. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to his office, but didn't get my hopes too high. By the time I arrived a half hour later, he was already on the phone with Bud's administration. Every sailor in that office, all of them white, were surprised to see me, except Shaljo. If I was a heavyweight, Shaljo was a lightweight at 5'7", but he didn't seem fazed by my size, at least not at first. He was outgoing and warm, like any salesman, though I could tell he had some pit bull in him. He led me down a hall to weigh me in, and while standing on the scale, I eyed a weight chart pinned to the wall. At my height, the maximum allowable weight for the Navy was 191 pounds. I held my breath, sucked in my gut as much as I could, and puffed out my chest in a sorry attempt to stave off the humiliating moment where he'd let me down easy. That moment never came. "You're a big boy," Shaljo said, smiling and shaking his head as he scratched 297 pounds on a chart in his file folder. The Navy has a program that allows recruits in the reserves to become active duty. That's what we'll use for this. It's being phased out at the end of the year, so we need to get you classed up before then. Point is, you have some work to do, but you knew that. I followed his eyes to the weight chart and checked it again. He nodded, smiled, patted me on the shoulder, and left me to face my truth. I had less than 3 months to lose 106 pounds. It sounded like an impossible task, which is one reason I didn't quit my job. The other was the ASVAB. That nightmare test had come back to life like Frankenstein's fucking monster. I'd passed it once before to enlist in the Air Force, but to qualify for BUDS, I'd have to score much higher. For 2 weeks, I studied all day and zapped pests each night. I wasn't working out yet. Serious weight loss would have to wait. I took the test on a Saturday afternoon. The following Monday, I called Shaljo. "Welcome to the Navy," he said. He downloaded the good news first. I'd done exceptionally well on some sections. I was now officially a reservist, but I'd only scored a 44 on mechanical comprehension. To qualify for BUD/S, I needed a 50. I'd have to retake the entire test in 5 weeks. These days, Stephen Shaljo likes to call our chance connection fate. He said he could sense my drive the first moment we spoke, and that he believed in me from the jump, which is why my weight wasn't an issue for him. But after that ASVAB test, I was full of doubt. So maybe what happened later that night was also a form of fate, or a much-needed dose of divine intervention. I'm not going to drop the name of the restaurant where it went down, because if I did, you'd never eat there again, and I'd have to hire a lawyer. Just know, this place was a disaster. I checked the traps outside first and found a dead rat. Inside, there were more dead rodents, a mouse and 2 rats on the sticky traps, and roaches in the garbage which hadn't been emptied. I shook my head, got down on my knees under the sink, and sprayed up through a narrow gap in the wall. I didn't know it yet, but I'd found their nesting column, and when the poison hit, they started to scatter. Within seconds, there was a skittering across the back of my neck. I brushed it off and craned my neck to see a storm of roaches raining down to the kitchen floor from an open panel in the ceiling. I'd hit the mother lode of cockroaches, and the worst infestation I ever saw on the job for Ecolab. They kept coming. Roaches landed on my shoulders and my head. The floor was writhing with them. I left my canister in the kitchen, grabbed the sticky traps, and burst outside. I needed fresh air and more time to figure out how I was going to clear the restaurant of vermin. I considered my options on my way to the dumpster to trash the rodents, opened the lid, and found a live raccoon, hissing mad. He bared his yellow teeth and lunged at me. I slammed the dumpster shut. What the fuck? I mean, seriously, what the fucking fuck? When was enough truly going to be enough? Was I willing to let my sorry present become a fucked up future? How much longer would I wait? How many more years would I burn, wondering if there was some greater purpose out there waiting for me? I knew right then that if I didn't make a stand and start walking the path of most resistance, I would end up in this mental hell forever. I didn't go back inside that restaurant. I didn't collect my gear. I started my truck, stopped for a chocolate shake, my comfort tea at that time, and drove home. It was still dark when I pulled up. I didn't care. I stripped off my work clothes, put on some sweats, and laced up my running shoes. I hadn't run in over a year, but I hit the streets ready to go 4 miles. I lasted 400 yards. My heart raced. I was so dizzy I had to sit down on the edge of the golf course to catch my breath before making the slow walk back to my house, where my melted shake was waiting to comfort me in yet another failure. I grabbed it, slurped, and slumped into my sofa. My eyes welled with tears. Who the fuck did I think I was? I was born nothing, I'd proven nothing, and I still wasn't worth a damn thing. David Goggins, a Navy SEAL? Yeah, right. What a pipe dream. I couldn't even run down the block for 5 minutes. All my fears and insecurities I'd bottled up for my entire life started raining down on my head. I was on the verge of giving in and giving up for good. That's when I found my old beat-to-shit VHS copy of Rocky, the one I'd had for 15 years, slid it into the machine, and fast-forwarded to my favorite scene, round 14. The original Rocky is still one of my all-time favorite films because it's about a know-nothing journeyman fighter living in poverty with no prospects. Even his own trainer won't work with him. Then, out of the blue, he's given a title shot with a champion, Apollo Creed, the most feared fighter in history. A man that has knocked out every opponent he's ever faced. All Rocky wants is to be the first to go the distance with Creed. That alone will make him someone he could be proud of for the first time in his life. The fight is closer than anyone anticipated, bloody and intense, and by the middle rounds, Rocky is taking on more and more punishment. He's losing the fight, and in round 14 he gets knocked down early, but pops right back up in the center of the ring. Apollo moves in, stalking him like a lion. He throws sharp left jabs, hits a slow-footed Rocky with a staggering combination, lands a punishing right hook, and another. He backs Rocky into a corner. Rocky's legs are jelly. He can't even muster the strength to raise his arms in defense. Apollo slams another right hook into the side of Rocky's head, then a left hook, and a vicious right-handed uppercut that puts Rocky down. Apollo retreats to the opposite corner with his arms held high. But even face down in that ring, Rocky doesn't give up. As the referee begins his 10 count, Rocky squirms toward the ropes. Mickey, his own trainer, urges him to stay down, but Rocky isn't hearing it. He pulls himself up to one knee, then all fours. The referee hits 6 as Rocky grabs the ropes and rises up. The crowd roars, and Apollo turns to see him still standing. Rocky waves Apollo over. The champ's shoulders slump in disbelief. The fight isn't over yet. I turned off the television and thought about my own life. It was a life devoid of any drive and passion, but I knew if I continued to surrender to my fear and my feelings of inadequacy, I would be allowing them to dictate my future forever. My only other choice was to try to find the power in the emotions that had laid me low, harness and use them to empower me to rise up, which is exactly what I did. I dumped that shake in the trash, laced up my shoes, and hit the streets again. On my first run, I felt severe pain in my legs and my lungs at a quarter mile. My heart raced and I stopped. This time I felt the same pain. My heart raced like a car running hot, but I ran through it and the pain faded. By the time I bent over to catch my breath, I'd run a full mile. That's when I first realized that not all physical and mental limitations are real, and that I had a habit of giving up way too soon. I also knew that it would take every ounce of courage and toughness I could muster to pull off the impossible. I was staring at hours, days, and weeks of nonstop suffering. I would have to push myself to the very edge of my mortality. I had to accept the very real possibility that I might die, because this time I wouldn't quit, no matter how fast my heart raced, and no matter how much pain I was in. Trouble was, there was no battle plan to follow, no blueprint. I had to create one from scratch. The typical day went something like this. I'd wake up at 4:30 a.m., munch a banana, and hit the ASVAB books. Around 5 a.m., I'd take that book to my stationary bike, where I'd sweat and study for 2 hours. Remember, my body was a mess. I couldn't run multiple miles yet, so I had to burn as many calories as I could on the bike. After that, I'd drive over to Carmel High School and jump into the pool for a 2-hour swim. From there, I hit the gym for a circuit workout that included the bench press, the incline press, and lots of leg exercises. Bulk was the enemy. I needed reps, and I did 5 or 6 sets of 100 to 200 reps each. Then it was back to the stationary bike for 2 more hours. I was constantly hungry. Dinner was my one true meal each day, but there wasn't much to it. I ate a grilled or sautéed chicken breast and some sautéed vegetables along with a thimble of rice. After dinner, I'd do another 2 hours on the bike, hit the sack, wake up and do it all over again, knowing the odds were stacked sky high against me. What I was trying to achieve is like a D student applying to Harvard, or walking into a casino and putting every single dollar you own on a number in roulette and acting as if winning is a foregone conclusion. I was betting everything I had on myself with no guarantees. I weighed myself twice daily, and within 2 weeks I dropped 25 pounds. My progress only improved as I kept grinding, and the weight started peeling off. 10 days later I was at 250, light enough to begin doing push-ups, pull-ups, and to start running my ass off. I'd still wake up, hit the stationary bike, the pool, and the gym, but I also incorporated 2, 3, and 4 mile runs. I ditched my running shoes and ordered a pair of Bates Lights, the same boots SEAL candidates wear in BUD/S, and started running in those. With so much effort, you'd think my nights would have been restful, but they were filled with anxiety. My stomach growled and my mind swirled. I'd dream of complex ASVAB questions and dread the next day's workouts. I was putting out so much on almost no fuel that depression became a natural side effect. My splintering marriage was veering toward divorce. Pam made it very clear that she and my stepdaughter would not be moving to San Diego with me, if by some miracle I could pull this off. They stayed in Brazil most of the time, and when I was all alone in Carmel, I was in turmoil. I felt both worthless and helpless as my endless stream of self-defeating thoughts picked up steam. When depression smothers you, it blots out all light and leaves you with nothing to cling onto for hope. All you see is negativity. For me, the only way to make it through that was to feed off my depression. I had to flip it and convince myself that all that self-doubt and anxiety was confirmation that I was no longer living an aimless life. My task may turn out to be impossible, but at least I was back on a motherfucking mission. Some nights when I was feeling low, I'd call Shaljo. He was always in the office early in the morning and late at night. I didn't confide in him about my depression because I didn't want him to doubt me. I used those calls to pump myself up. I told him how many pounds I dropped and how much work I was putting in, and he reminded me to keep studying for that ASVAB. Roger that. I had the Rocky soundtrack on cassette, and I'd listened to Going the Distance for inspiration. On long bike rides and runs, with those horns blasting in my brain, I'd imagine myself going through buds, diving into cold water, and crushing Hell Week. I was wishing, I was hoping. But by the time I was down to 250, my quest to qualify for the SEALs wasn't a daydream anymore. I had a real chance to accomplish something most people, including myself, thought was impossible. Still, there were bad days. One morning, not long after I dipped below 250, I weighed in, and I'd only lost a pound from the day before. I had so much weight to lose I could not afford to plateau. That's all I thought about while running 6 miles and swimming 2. I was exhausted and sore when I arrived in the gym for my typical 3-hour circuit. After rocking over 100 pull-ups in a series of sets, I was back on the bar for a max set with no ceiling. Going in, my goal was to get to 12, but my hands were burning fire as I stretched my chin over the bar for the 10th time. For weeks, the temptation to pull back had been ever present, and I always refused. That day, however, the pain was too much, and after my 11th pull-up, I gave in, dropped down, and finished my workout, 1 pull-up shy. That 1 rep stayed with me, along with that 1 pound. I tried to get them out of my head, but they wouldn't leave me the fuck alone. They taunted me on the drive home and at my kitchen table while I ate a sliver of grilled chicken and a bland baked potato. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night unless I did something about it, so I grabbed my keys. "You cut corners and you are not gonna fucking make it," I said out loud as I drove back to the gym. "There are no shortcuts for you, Goggins." I did my entire pull-up workout over again. 1 missed pull-up cost me an extra $250, and there would be similar episodes. Whenever I cut or run or swim short because I was hungry or tired, I'd always go back and beat myself down even harder. That was the only way I could manage the demons in my mind. Either way, there would be suffering. I had to choose between physical suffering in the moment and the mental anguish of wondering if that 1 missed pull-up, that last lap in the pool, the quarter mile I skipped on the road or trail would end up costing me an opportunity of a lifetime. It was an easy choice. When it came to the SEALs, I wasn't leaving anything up to chance. On the eve of the ASVAB, with 4 weeks to go before training, making weight was no longer a worry. I was already down to 215 pounds and was faster and stronger than I'd ever been. I was running 6 miles a day, bicycling over 20 miles, and swimming more than 2, all of it in the dead of winter. My favorite run was the 6-mile Monon Trail, an asphalt bike and walking path that laced through the trees in Indianapolis. It was the domain of cyclists and soccer moms with jogging strollers, weekend warriors and seniors. By then, Shaljo had passed along the Navy SEAL warning order. It included all the workouts I would be expected to complete during the first phase of BUDS, and I was happy to double them. I knew that 190 men usually class up for a typical SEAL training, and only about 40 people make it all the way through. I didn't want to be just one of those 40. I wanted to be the best. But I had to pass the damn ASVAB first. I'd been cramming every spare second. If I wasn't working out, I was at my kitchen table, memorizing formulas and cycling through hundreds of vocabulary words. With my physical training going well, all my anxieties stuck to the ASVAB like paper clips to a magnet. This would be my last chance to take the test before my eligibility for the SEALs expired. I wasn't very smart, and based on past academic performance, there was no good reason to believe I'd pass with a score high enough to qualify for the SEALs. If I failed, my dream would die, and I'd be floating without purpose once again. The test was held in a small classroom on Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis. There were about 30 people there, all of us young. Most were just out of high school. We were each assigned an old-school desktop computer. In the past month, the test had been digitized, and I wasn't experienced with computers. I didn't even think I could work the damn machine, let alone answer the questions. But the program proved idiot-proof, and I settled in. The ASVAB has 10 sections, and I was breezing through until I reached mechanical comprehension, my truth serum. Within the hour, I would have a decent idea if I'd been lying to myself, or if I had the raw stuff necessary to become a SEAL. Whenever a question stumped me, I marked my worksheet with a dash. There were about 30 questions in that section, and by the time I completed the test, I'd guessed at least 10 times. I needed some of them to go my way, or I was out. After completing the final section, I was prompted to send the entire bundle to the administrator's computer at the front of the room, where the score would be tabulated instantly. I peeked over my monitor and saw him sitting there, waiting. I pointed, clicked, and left the room. Buzzing with nervous energy, I paced the parking lot for a few minutes before finally ducking into my Honda Accord, but I didn't start the engine. I couldn't leave. I sat in the front seat for 15 minutes with a 1,000-yard stare. It would be at least 2 days before Xiaozhou would call with my results, but the answer to the riddle that was my future was already solved. I knew exactly where it was, and I had to know the truth. I gathered myself, walked back in, and approached the fortune teller. "You gotta tell me what I got on this fucking test, man," I said. He peered up at me, surprised, but he didn't buckle. "I'm sorry, son. This is the government. There's a system for how they do things," he said. "I didn't make the rules, and I can't bend them." "Sir, you have no idea what this test means to me, to my life. It's everything." He looked into my glassy eyes for what felt like 5 minutes, then turned toward his machine. "I'm breaking every rule in the book right now," he said. "Goggins, right?" I nodded and came around behind his seat as he scrolled through files. "There you are. Congratulations, you scored 65. That's a great score." He was referencing my overall, but I didn't care about that. Everything hinged on my getting a 50 spot where it counted most. "What did I get on mechanical comprehension?" He shrugged, clicked, and scrolled, and there it was. My new favorite number glowed on his screen. 50. "Yes!" I shouted. "Yes! Yes!" There were still a handful of others taking the test, but this was the happiest moment in my life, and I couldn't stifle it. I kept screaming, "Yes!" at the top of my lungs. The administrator damn near fell out of his chair, and everyone in that room stared at me like I was crazy. If they only knew how crazed I'd been. For 2 months, I dedicated my entire existence toward this one moment, and I was damn well going to enjoy it. I rushed to my car and screamed some more. "Fuck yeah!" On my drive home, I called my mom. She was the one person aside from Xiaozhou who witnessed my metamorphosis. "I fucking did it," I told her, tears in my eyes. "I fucking did it! I'm going to be a SEAL!" When Xiaozhou came to work the next day, he got the news and called me up. He'd sent in my recruitment package and had just heard back that I was in. I could tell he was happy for me and proud that what he saw in me the first time we met turned out to be real. But it wasn't all happy days. My wife had given me an implied ultimatum, and now I had a decision to make. Abandon the opportunity I'd worked so hard for and stay married, or get divorced and go try and become a SEAL. In the end, my choice didn't have anything to do with my feelings for Pam or her father. He'd apologized to me, by the way. It was about who I was and who I wanted to be. I was a prisoner in my own mind, and this opportunity was my only chance to break free. I celebrated my victory the way any SEAL candidate should. I put the fuck out. The following morning, and for the next 3 weeks, I spent time in the pool, strapped with a 16-pound weight belt. I swam underwater for 50 meters at a time, and walked the length of the pool underwater with a brick in each hand, all in a single breath. The water would not own my ass this time. When I was done, I'd swim a mile or two, then head to a pond near my mother's home. Remember, this was Indiana, the American Midwest, in December. The trees were naked. Icicles hung like crystals from the eaves of houses, and snow blanketed the earth in all directions. But the pond wasn't completely frozen yet. I waded into the icy water, dressed in camo pants, a brown short-sleeved t-shirt, and boots, laid back and looked into the gray sky. The hypothermic water washed over me. The pain was excruciating, and I fucking loved it. After a few minutes, I got out and started running, water sloshing in my boots, sand in my underwear. Within seconds, my t-shirt was frozen to my chest, my pants iced at the cuffs. I hit the Monon Trail. Steam poured from my nose and mouth as I grunted and slalomed speedwalkers and joggers. Civilians. Their heads turned as I picked up speed and began sprinting like Rocky in downtown Philly. I ran as fast as I could, for as long as I could. From a past that no longer defined me, toward a future undetermined. All I knew was that there would be pain, and there would be purpose, and that I was ready. That was an impossible task.
You know what, man? When I hear you read that, still to this day, it makes me very emotional. And like that scene with me taking the ASVAB test and me walking back out to the car and me walking around and then me getting in my car, then me coming back in and literally begging the guy. I mean, I was literally almost crying because my whole life was just sitting on that 50. And so what people never, we did a good job of making that scene as powerful as it is. But, this whole book of mine, it went to auction, as you know, Adam. And that scene that you just read, this chapter that you just read, this is one of the main reasons why, I got offered $300,000 for my book. And that chapter that you just read is a major reason why I couldn't sell my life to anybody. Going back through, listening to you, just pretty much read my life story in that section, and there's so much more things to come. It made me realize why this is the only trophy. This is the only trophy that I would truly, have in my life. And that chapter is where this really started for me. I started really figuring out what life was all about. I didn't figure it out completely, but you talking that, you reading that story, it lets me know why there wasn't any amount of money that I was going to take for the shit I put myself through to be where I'm at today.
It's very interesting. I want to go on record as saying I encourage you to take that book deal, which is the wrong decision.
Right.
As we'll soon know, it would have been the wrong decision. So
right.
never listen to me about business. But I will say that I could understand it, because it seems to me that you were in not just a physical bunker mentality, but a mental and emotional bunker mentality. Yeah, your mom could penetrate the bunker a little bit, but really you had to be in your own bunker.
Right.
And that's a very lonely and isolating place to be. I mean, going through this journey with you and hearing what you had to go through, my heart goes out to you, because you had basically put it all on this. Now, you might have come out of this, if you failed, we don't know what would have happened. Would all of that hard work dissipated? Would you have had to go back and get some wage job? Would you have never achieved anything? We don't really know. But in your mind at that moment, you couldn't afford that. Like there was, you didn't have the slack to give yourself.
Right.
You had to go forward. You had to do this, or the odds were you were going to be the statistic you were always supposed to be.
And that was the hard part about this was I couldn't give myself even just like a little break.
Yeah.
And there was sometimes I would literally look at my running shoes for 30 to 40 minutes, because when you're that big, I mean, I was so broken every single day,
Yeah.
I would literally look at all these, okay, now I would get done running 6 miles and know I had, 2 hours on the bike, and then there were 2 hours at nighttime, and I had to go swim 2 more miles, and I had 3 hours in the gym. And just knowing that there was every single fucking day you were going to have to relive this hell. And there were some days I couldn't even get out of bed. I was so sore. And then to know that I had to get out of bed, and literally like for the first hour and a half, my body just didn't want to move. And to force it.
Is it hard to also study and kind of do the hard intellectual work while you're sore like that? That must be really hard, right? I mean, it's not a break.
Well, that's what sucked for me also, was I was literally so I had to earn. I never sat down. I had to always earn my right to watch TV. So how I did that was I got a stationary bike, put it in my house, an old cheap Walmart stationary bike, and I would be there, and I had I kind of propped up some, those like little eating tables, and I put my books on there, and I was just studying, and I would study I was so obsessed. And that's one thing I talk about when I tell people about motivation. I always say motivation is crap. And people go, how do you say that? All it is, it's just a little bit of kindling. That's all it is. You have to be like for instance, some people are going to read this book and be so fucking motivated, and they're going to have a bad day. And on that bad day, their motivation is going to be fucking gone. It's going to be gone. So I realized about the human mind, that I had to be more than motivated. I had to be more than driven. I had to become literally obsessed to the point where people thought I was fucking nuts. You know, like the colder it was, the better it was. The more I suffered, the more I had to this literally take all of this stuff and wrap it up and just be like, okay, fuck it. This is what's going to happen now. And I had to start really just callousing my mind.
It's, just reading these chapters that we read today, and for listeners, we're being super transparent. We're recording this over a period of 5 days. And these first 3 chapters are done in the first session. And you know what I think is so interesting about this book and your life? It's the way you crack stereotypes. And I'm not talking about ethnic stereotypes. I'm talking about, Sister Catherine, how you're never going to judge a smile or a scowl.
Right.
It's the same idea when I hear this. It's like we don't know what the people that we interact with in our hometowns and the cities that we live in, what they're going through. And, I could picture you in bunker mentality, not giving anybody any smiles, being all business, and people taking that personally, when in reality, you're trying to do something really important for yourself. And it's all about your own journey, and you didn't have any hate towards anybody else.
Right.
And there's people out there all the time going through what they're going through, and you just can't judge it. And it's very interesting. That's what I love about what you do, because I think that you kind of recalibrate what we expect from people,
right,
and how to appreciate people.
And see, even now, you guys have heard my story, at least a fraction of it, about how I got called nigger. And I hate no one. I dislike some people just because of some issues that we have. When you are constantly judged your whole life, when you are, as we call it in the book, the only your whole life, how the fuck am I now going to walk around in my, in this world I live in and judge anybody? Because I know how it feels to be judged. And what's so stupid is so many people who have been judged, they now judge other people. We forget how it feels to be the only person, how it feels to be judged. I don't forget it. I remember, so I'm all about people being whoever the hell they are, be it, own it, wear it like a fucking badge of honor.
Love it. And so the next challenge is it's kind of the first step on the journey towards callousing your mind. That's how we start the next challenge. And that's what this was, right? This is where you really started to callous your mind, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, for sure. This is when I started literally trying to callous over that whole victim's mentality.
Challenge 3. The first step on the journey toward a calloused mind is stepping outside your comfort zone on a regular basis. Dig out your journal again and write down all the things you don't like to do or that make you uncomfortable, especially those things you know are good for you. Now go do one of them, and do it again. In the coming pages, I'll be asking you to mirror what you just read to some degree, but there is no need for you to find your own impossible task and achieve it on the fast track. This is not about changing your life instantly. It's about moving the needle bit by bit and making those changes sustainable. That means digging down to the micro level and doing something that sucks every day. Even if it's as simple as making your bed, doing the dishes, ironing your clothes, or getting up before dawn and running 2 miles each day. Once that becomes comfortable, take it to 5, then 10 miles. If you already do all those things, find something you aren't doing. We all have areas in our lives we either ignore or can improve upon. Find yours. We often choose to focus on our strengths rather than our weaknesses. Use this time to make your weaknesses your strengths. Doing things, even small things, that make you uncomfortable will help make you strong. The more often you get uncomfortable, the stronger you'll become, and soon you'll develop a more productive, can-do dialogue with yourself in stressful situations. Take a photo or video of yourself in the discomfort zone. Post it on social media describing what you're doing and why. And don't forget to include the hashtags. Hashtag discomfort zone. Hashtag path of most resistance. Hashtag can't hurt me. Hashtag impossible task. So this one, you're not giving them a specific thing. You're asking them to look inside and figure out what they don't like to do. This is about really getting out of your comfort zone, because that's what you had to do when you were kind of in your own fugue state with no purpose.
Right. One question I get all the time is, man, how did you become so damn mentally strong? How did you do this? I think everybody knows the answer. Everybody knows the answer, but they would love for me to give you a nice, simple, hey, it really is easy. That's what they want to hear. But the truth of the matter is this, man. Honestly, the only way you are ever going to become hard and learn to callous your mind is you have to do the things that you do not want to do. There's no way around it. Like a lot of people, if you like running, they will run. They just keep on running. I'm not saying don't do things you don't enjoy, but I'm saying that if you're looking for the advantage, if you're trying to get the advantage, you have to do those things that kind of make you say, "Oh man, I really don't want to do this shit right now." That's going to really challenge me mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Those are the things you have to start gravitating to. Like a lot of people say, triple down on your strengths. Yeah, that's good for some things. But if you want to fucking really get hard and become that hardened person and get true mental toughness, you have to triple down on your weaknesses. And that's the only way you can start to callous that mind and start callousing over all of that. You have to learn to callous over that victim's mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people say triple down on your strengths, they're basically implying pick a lane, do that, become an expert in one thing. But you're not talking to people about what you went through to make them an expert in anything. Your whole thing about callousing the mind, becoming better, is to make them a more unbreakable human being. And that's emotionally and physically and mentally. And I think that that's a very different thing. And don't you think that's your purpose? I mean, you're not trying to get someone to become the best this or that.
No.
I mean, that's shallow, really, if you think about
It's
it.
100% shallow. And once again, you're listening to my story right now. This isn't about me. This isn't about me. This is about me challenging you to look inward and to start, developing that hero inside of you. And these are all steps for you to, not even steps. These are things for you to take on board in your life and think about, you know what? I could be doing more. I am afraid of this. I don't want to do that. So just look at yourself and start challenging yourself even more.
You saying that makes me think of something else, is that we've talked about this before, and that is, all of this great task that you just accomplished in this chapter, that didn't give you anything really other than another opportunity to fail.
You know what? That's 100% correct, man. Like, losing. So it wasn't like Steven Saljo came, miracled me and said, hey, man, if you lose 106 pounds and you pass the ASVAB, I'm going to miracle Navy SEAL Trident on your chest.
No.
This was all a chance. And that's the thing about life is a lot of us are not, if we're not guaranteed something, we don't want to take that chance. We're looking at it like right now, I could easily sat back and said, oh my God, losing 106 pounds? There's not even, I may not even graduate buds or, retake the ASVAB test. I might even graduate buds. If that is your mindset and that is your thinking, you have already lost. You have already lost. All this is you have to put yourself in a position to win. Some of us don't even want to put ourselves in a position to win. So I knew losing 106 pounds, taking the ASVAB test again, was just me putting myself in a position to succeed. But most of us don't have the courage to put ourselves in a position to win. Why? Because failing is almost too much to handle. So why even try? Why even try? Because if I never tried, I can never fail. So that's the mindset of a lot of people.
But in this case, it's not just a small risk. First of all, you're preparing to walk away from your marriage,
right?
And the success rate for a SEAL in buds is 20%.
Exactly.
And so you do all this, you put all this out, and now you have a 20% chance of taking the next step. I mean, you still had a lot on the line and a lot ahead of you.
But you know what the beauty of that is, Adam? Is I had so much on the line and so much ahead of me. But what was happening What was happening when I was losing that weight and I was passing the ASVAB and I was going through all these daily struggles? I started finding a whole new David Goggins. That was the power of all this. My confidence started growing. So if you can lose 106 pounds in 3 months, what the fuck else can I do? If I can go back and retake the ASVAB and fail and fail and fail and continue to, strive for excellence in failure, all that was doing for me was making me more and more psyched up to be better. So I was just constantly fueling the machine. So even though it wasn't guaranteed I was going to get through SEAL training, my chances were looking pretty fucking good.
So before we get into some stuff from Buds, which I'm really excited to share with the readers, I know you are, let's just recap that, because what you're talking about here is mindset. Isn't that right? Exactly.
It's all about mindset. And throughout this whole book, you're going to realize that it's going to always come back to one thing: mindset. And it's your mindset. It's how you speak to yourself. It's also where you want to be at.
So that means constantly monitoring what you're thinking and so that you can control it. I always think about, don't believe everything you feel, because sometimes you might feel a certain way about some person or about some situation, but that first feeling isn't necessarily going to get you anything. It's not going to be a solution. It's usually something to ignore, wouldn't you say?
Oh, 100%. Life is all about feelings. And a lot of times we create this reality, and it's a false reality. And we live in this false reality, and it starts to control our lives. And it takes a really strong person. It has to come from you. You have to create. It's not creating at all. You have to go to the real reality. Sometimes it's not as bad as you've made it out to be. And, it all comes when, for instance, like, basically life is relentless. It just keeps coming at you, man. So you got to be prepared for it.
I was reading yesterday, Nelson Mandela on his way out of prison. He was wrongfully imprisoned for 20 years or more. I forget exactly the number, decades, by white supremacists in South Africa. And on his way out, he knew, he's written about this, he knew he had to leave the bitterness behind him or he'd never be free.
Exactly.
And that's mindset, isn't it?
It's 100% mindset. Like, for instance, life is going to constantly come at you. So we have to control the things we can control. Like, for instance, this morning, I woke up this morning and we got out of here pretty late yesterday. And I went home, got back to the room about, midnight, and did my 2-hour stretching. And I woke up at about 6 o'clock this morning and went for a 7-mile run. I do all these things, not because I enjoy them, because I know once I leave my house, a lot of things are out of my control. So I am trying to win these small battles, win these, trying to just have these small victories that I can take with me outside. So once I leave my house, if I've gotten up in the morning and I've, done my routine as far as going for a run, doing my push-ups, doing my pull-ups, I am basically trying to prepare my mind for the challenges that are going to come my way that I cannot control. So you always have to constantly start to kind of get your mind ready for what's to come.
Perfect. And I think that's the perfect transition into Taking Souls, the next chapter. Just so you guys are clued in, this is day 2 here in the recording studio. It's a beautiful day outside, and we are in separate dark cubicles wired together.
Yes, man, I am back in the box.
We're in the box.
We're in the box, man. Nothing in life is going to, it's not going to be ideal. We are always looking for an ideal situation. Everything has to be perfect for us to succeed. That is not what it's about. We have to be great in a situation that is not always perfect.
And if there's one thing about Hell Week, is it wasn't perfect, was it?
No, it was never perfect, but you had to find something more. That's what Taking Souls is all about. You had to find strength when there was no strength around. Sometimes you had to invent strength.
Chapter 4, Taking Souls. The first concussion grenade exploded at close range, and from there everything unraveled in slow motion. 1 minute we were chilling in the common room, bullshitting, watching war movies, getting pumped up for the battle we knew was coming. Then that first explosion led to another, and suddenly Psycho Pete was in our faces, screaming at the top of his lungs. His cheeks flushed candy apple red, that vein in his right temple throbbing. When he screamed, his eyes bugged out, and his whole body shook. "Break the fuck out! Move! Move! Move!" My boat crew sprinted for the door single file, just like we'd planned. Outside, Navy SEALs were firing their M60s into the darkness, towards some invisible enemy. It was the bad dream we'd been waiting for our entire lives, the lucid nightmare that would define or kill us. Every impulse we had told us to hit the dirt, but at that moment, movement was our only option. The repetitive, deep bass thud of machine gun fire penetrated our guts. The orange halo from another explosion in the near distance provided a shock of violent beauty, and our hearts hammered as we gathered on the grinder, awaiting orders. This was war, all right, but it wouldn't be fought on some foreign shore. This one, like most battles we fight in life, would be won or lost in our own minds. Psycho Pete stomped the pocked asphalt, his brow slick with sweat, the muzzle of his rifle steaming in the foggy night. "Welcome to Hell Week, gentlemen," he said, calmly this time, in that sing-song Cali surfer drawl of his. He looked us up and down like a predator eyeing his kill. "It will be my great pleasure to watch you suffer." Oh, and there would be suffering. Psycho set the tempo, called out the push-ups, sit-ups, and flutter kicks, the jumping lunges and dive bombers. In between, he and his fellow instructors hosed us down with freezing water, cackling the whole damn time. There were countless reps and set after set, with no end in sight. My classmates were gathered close, each of us on our own stenciled frog footprints, overlooked by a statue of our patron saint, the Frogman, a scaly alien creature from the deep, with webbed feet and hands, sharp claws, and a motherfucking six-pack. To his left was the infamous brass bell. Ever since that morning when I came home from cockroach duty and got sucked into the Navy SEAL show, it was this place that I'd sought. The grinder. A slab of asphalt dripping with history and misery. Bud's training is 6 months long and divided into 3 phases. First phase is all about physical training, or PT. Second phase is dive training, where we learn how to navigate underwater and deploy stealthy, closed-circuit diving systems that emit no bubbles and recycle our carbon dioxide into breathable air. Third phase is land warfare training. But when most people picture BUD/S, they think of first phase, because those are the weeks that tenderize new recruits, until the class is literally ground down from about 120 guys to the hard, gleaming spine that are the 25 to 40 guys who are more worthy of the trident. The emblem that tells the world we are not to be fucked with. BUD/S instructors do that by working guys out beyond their perceived limits, by challenging their manhood, and insisting on objective physical standards of strength, stamina, and agility. Standards that are tested. In those first 3 weeks of training, we had to, among other things, climb a vertical 10-meter rope, hammer a half-mile-long obstacle course studded with American Ninja Warrior-type challenges in under 10 minutes, and run 4 miles on the sand in under 32 minutes. But if you ask me, all that was child's play. It couldn't even compare to the crucible of first phase. Hell Week is something entirely different. It's medieval, and it comes at you fast, detonating in just the 3rd week of training. When the throbbing ache in our muscles and joints was ratcheted up high, and we lived day and night with an edgy, hyperventilating feeling of our breath getting out front of our physical rhythm, of our lungs inflating and deflating, like canvas bags squeezed tight in a demon's fists, for 130 hours straight. That's a test that goes way beyond the physical, and reveals your heart and character. More than anything, it reveals your mindset, which is exactly what it's designed to do. All of this happened at the Naval Special Warfare Command Center on prissy-ass Coronado Island, a Southern California tourist trap that tucks into slender Point Loma and shelters the San Diego Marina from the open Pacific Ocean. But even Cali's golden sun couldn't pretty up the grinder, and thank God for that. I liked it ugly. That slab of agony was everything I'd ever wanted. Not because I loved to suffer, but because I needed to know whether or not I had what it took to belong. Thing is, most people don't. By the time Hell Week started, at least 40 guys had already quit, and when they did, they were forced to walk over to the bell, ring it 3 times, and place their helmet on the concrete. The ringing of the bell was first brought in during the Vietnam era, because so many guys were quitting during evolutions and just walking off to the barracks. The bell was a way to keep track of guys, but since then it's become a ritual that a man has to perform to own the fact that he's quitting. To the quitter, the bell is closure. To me, every clang sounded like progress. I never liked Psycho much, but I couldn't quibble with the specifics of his job. He and his fellow instructors were there to cull the herd. Plus, he wasn't going after the runts. He was in my face plenty, and guys bigger than me too. Even the smaller dudes were studs. I was one man in a fleet of alpha specimens from back east and down south, the blue-collar and big-money surf beaches of California, a few from corn country like me, and plenty from the Texas rangeland. Every Buds class has their share of hard-ass backcountry Texans. No state puts more seals in the pipeline. Must be something in the barbecue, but Psycho didn't play favorites. No matter where we were from or who we were, he lingered like a shadow we couldn't shake, laughing, screaming, or quietly taunting us to our face, attempting to burrow into the brain of any man he tried to break. Despite all that, the first hour of Hell Week was actually fun. During Breakout, that mad rush of explosions, shooting, and shouting, you are not even thinking about the nightmare to come. You're riding an adrenaline high, because you know you're fulfilling a rite of passage within a hallowed warrior tradition. Guys are looking around the grinder, practically giddy, thinking, yeah, we're in Hell Week, motherfuckers. But reality has a way of kicking everyone in the teeth sooner or later. You call this putting out? Psycho Pete asked no one in particular. This may be the single sorriest class we ever put through our program. You men are straight up embarrassing yourselves. He relished this part of the job, stepping over and between us, his boot print in our pooling sweat and saliva, snot, tears, and blood. He thought he was hard. All the instructors did. And they were, because they were SEALs. That fact alone placed them in rare air. You boys couldn't have held my jock when I went through Hell Week, I'll tell you that much. I smiled to myself and kept hammering as Psycho brushed by. He was built like a tailback, quick and strong. But was he a mortal fucking weapon during his Hell Week? Sir, I doubt that very fucking much, sir. He caught the eye of his boss, the first phase officer in charge. There was no doubt about him. He didn't talk a whole lot, and didn't have to. He was 6'1", but he cast a longer shadow. Dude was jacked, too. I'm talking about 225 pounds of muscle, wrapped tight as steel, without an ounce of sympathy. He looked like a silverback gorilla, and loomed like a godfather of pain, making silent calculations, taking mental notes. Sir, my dick's getting stiff just thinking about these gaping vaginas, weeping and quitting like whiny little bitches this week, Psycho said. SBG offered half a nod as Psycho stared through me. Oh, and you will quit, he said softly. I'll make sure of that. Psycho's threats were spookier when he delivered them in a relaxed tone like that. But there were plenty of times when his eyes went dark, his brow twisted, the blood rushed to his face, and he unleashed a scream that built from the tips of his toes to the crown of his bald head. An hour into Hell Week, he knelt down, pressed his face within an inch of my own while I finished another set of push-ups, and let loose. Hit the surf, you miserable fucking turds! We'd been in Buds for nearly 3 weeks by then, and we'd raced up and over the 15-foot berm that divided the beach from the cinder-block sprawl of offices, locker rooms, barracks, and classrooms that is the Buds compound, plenty of times. Usually to lie back in the shallows, fully dressed, then roll in the sand, until we were covered in sand from head to toe, before charging back to the grinder, dripping heavy with salt water and sand, which ramped up the degree of difficulty on the pull-up bar. That ritual was called getting wet and sandy, and they wanted sand in our ears, up our noses, and in every orifice of our body. But this time we were on the verge of something called surf torture. which is a special kind of beast. As instructed, we charged into the surf, screaming like senseis. Fully clothed, arms linked, we waded into the impact zone. The surf was angry that moonless night, nearly head high, and the waves were rolling thunder that barreled and foamed in sets of 3 and 4. Cold water shriveled our balls and swiped the breath from our lungs as the waves thrashed us. This was early May, and in the spring the ocean off Coronado ranges from 59 to 63 degrees. We bobbed up and down as one, a pearl strand of floating heads scanning the horizon for any hint of swell we prayed we'd see coming before it towed us under. The surfers in our crew detected doom first and called out the waves so we could duck dive just in time. After 10 minutes or so, Psycho ordered us back to land. On the verge of hypothermia, we scrambled from the surf zone and stood at attention while being checked by the doctor for hypothermia. That cycle would continue to repeat itself. The sky was smeared orange and red. The temperature dropped sharply as night loomed close. "Say goodbye to the sun, gents," SBG said. He made us wave at the setting sun, a symbolic acknowledgement of an inconvenient truth. We were about to freeze our natural asses off. After an hour, we fell back into our 6-man boat cruise and stood nut to butt, huddling tight to get warm, but it was futile. Bones were rattling up and down that beach. Guys were jackhammering and sniffling, a physical state revealing the quaking conditions of splintering minds, which were just now coming to grips with the reality that this shit had only just begun. Even on the hardest days of first phase, prior to Hell Week, when the sheer volume of rope climbs and push-ups, pull-ups and flutter kicks crushes your spirit, you can find a way out, because you know that no matter how much it sucks, you'll head home that night, meet friends for dinner, see a movie, maybe get some pussy, and sleep in your own bed. The point is, even on miserable days, you can fixate on an escape from hell that's real. Hell Week offers no such love, especially on day 1, when an hour in they had us standing, linking arms, facing the Pacific Ocean, wading in and out of the surf for hours. In between, we were gifted soft sand sprints to warm up. Usually they had us carry our rigid inflatable boat or a log overhead. But the warmth, if it ever arrived, was always short-lived, because every 10 minutes they rotated us back into the water. The clock ticked slowly that first night as the cold seeped in, colonizing our marrow so thoroughly the run stopped doing any good. There would be no more bombs, no more shooting, and very little yelling. Instead, an eerie quiet expanded and deadened our spirit. In the ocean, all any of us could hear were the waves going overhead, the seawater we accidentally swallowed roiling in our guts, and our own teeth chattering. When you're that cold and stressed, the mind cannot comprehend the next 120-plus hours. 5.5 days without sleep cannot be broken up into small pieces. There is no way to systematically attack it, which is why every single person who has ever tried to become a SEAL has asked himself one simple question during their first dose of surf torture. Why am I here? Those innocuous words bubbled up in our spinning minds each time we got sucked under a monster wave at midnight, when we were already borderline hypothermic. Because nobody has to become a SEAL. We weren't fucking drafted. Becoming a SEAL is a choice, and what that single softball question revealed in the heat of battle is that each second we remained in training was also a choice, which made the entire notion of becoming a SEAL seem like masochism. It's voluntary torture, and that makes no sense at all to the rational mind, which is why those 4 words unravel so many men. The instructors know all of this, of course, which is why they stopped yelling early on. Instead, as the night wore on, Psycho Pete consoled us like a concerned older brother. He offered us hot soup, a warm shower, blankets, a ride back to the barracks. That was the bait he set for quitters to snap up, and he harvested helmets left and right. He was taking the souls of those who caved because they couldn't answer that simple question. I get it. When it's only Sunday and you know you're going to Friday, and you're already far colder than you've ever been, you're tempted to believe that you can't hack it, and that nobody can. Married guys were thinking, I could be at home cuddled up to my beautiful wife instead of shivering and suffering. Single guys were thinking, I could be on the hunt for pussy right now. It's tough to ignore that kind of glittering lure. But this was my second lap through the early stages of BUD/S. I'd tasted the evil of Hell Week as part of Class 230. I didn't make it, but I didn't quit. I was pulled out on a medical after contracting double pneumonia. I defied doctor's orders 3 times and tried to stay in the fight, but they eventually forced me to the barracks and rolled me back to day 1, week 1 of Class 231. I wasn't all the way healed up from that bout of pneumonia when my second buds class kicked off. My lungs were still filled with mucus, and each cough shook my chest and sounded like a rake was scraping the inside of my alveoli. Still, I liked my chances a lot better this time around, because I was prepared, and because I was in a boat crew thick with bad motherfuckers. Bud's boat crews are sorted by height, because those are the guys who will help you carry your boat everywhere you go once Hell Week begins. Size alone didn't guarantee your teammates will be tough, however, and our guys were a crew of square-peg misfits. There was me, the exterminator who had to drop 100 pounds and take the ASVAB test twice just to get to SEAL training, only to be rolled back almost immediately. We also had the late Chris Kyle. You know him as the deadliest sniper in Navy history. He was so successful, the Hajis in Fallujah put an $80,000 bounty on his head, and he became a living legend among the Marines he protected as a member of SEAL Team 3. He won a Silver Star and 4 Bronze Stars for valor, left the military, and wrote a book, American Sniper, that became a hit movie starring Bradley fucking Cooper. But back then he was a simple Texas hayseed rodeo cowboy who barely said a damn word. Then there was Bill Brown, a.k.a. Freak Brown. Most people just called him Freak, and he hated it because he'd been treated like one his whole damn life. In many ways, he was the white version of David Goggins. He came up tough in the river towns of South Jersey. Older kids in the neighborhood bullied him because of his cleft palate or because he was slow in class, which is how that nickname stuck. He got into enough fights over it that he eventually landed in a youth detention center for a 6-month stretch. By the time he was 19, he was living on his own in the hood, trying to make ends meet as a gas station attendant. It wasn't working. He had no coat and no car. He commuted everywhere on a rusted-out 10-speed bike, literally freezing his balls off. One day after work, he stopped into a Navy recruitment office because he knew he needed structure and purpose and some warm clothes. They told him about the SEALs, and he was intrigued, but he couldn't swim. Just like me, he taught himself, and after 3 attempts, he finally passed the SEAL swim test. Next thing he knew, Brown was in Buds, where that Freak nickname followed him. He rocked PT and sailed through first phase, but he wasn't nearly as solid in the classroom. Navy SEAL dive training is as tough intellectually as it is physically, but he scraped by and got within 2 weeks of becoming a Buds graduate, when in one of his final land warfare evolutions, he failed reassembling his weapon in a timed evolution known as Weapons Practical. Brown hit his targets but missed the time, and he flunked out of Buds at the bitter end. But he didn't give up. No, sir, Freak Brown wasn't going anywhere. I'd heard stories about him before he washed up with me in Class 231. He had 2 chips on his shoulders, and I liked him immediately. He was hard as hell and exactly the kind of guy I signed up to go to war with. When we carried our boat from the grinder to the sand for the first time, I made sure we were the 2 men at the front, where the boat is at its heaviest. "Freak Brown," I shouted, "we will be the pillars of Boat Crew 2. He looked over, and I glared back. "Don't fucking call me that, Goggins," he said with a snarl. "Well, don't you move out of position, son. You and me, up front, all fucking week." "Roger that," he said. I took the lead of Boat Crew 2 from the beginning, and getting all 6 of us through Hell Week was my singular focus. Everyone fell in line because I'd already proven myself, and not just on the grinder. In the days before Hell Week began, I got it into my head that we needed to steal the Hell Week schedule from our instructors. I told our crew as much one night when we were hanging in the classroom, which doubled as our lounge. My words fell on deaf ears. A few guys laughed, but everyone else ignored me and went back to their shallow-ass conversations. I understood why. It made no sense. How were we supposed to get a copy of their shit? And even if we did, wouldn't the anticipation make it worse? And what if we got caught? Was the reward worth the risk? I believed it was, because I'd tasted Hell Week. Brown and a few other guys had too, and we knew how easy it was to think about quitting when confronted with levels of pain and exhaustion you didn't think possible. 130 hours of suffering may as well be 1,000 when you know you can't sleep, and that there will be no relief anytime soon. And we knew something else too. Hell Week was a mind game. The instructors used our suffering to pick and peel away our layers, not to find the fittest athletes, to find the strongest minds. That's something the quitters didn't understand until it was too late. Everything in life is a mind game. Whenever we get swept under by life's dramas, large and small, we are forgetting that no matter how bad the pain gets, no matter how harrowing the torture, all bad things end. That forgetting happens the second we give control over our emotions and actions to other people, which can easily happen when pain is peaking. During Hell Week, the men who quit felt like they were running on a treadmill turned way the fuck up, with no dashboard within reach. But whether they figured it out or not, that was an illusion they fell for. I went into Hell Week knowing I put myself there, that I wanted to be there, and that I had all the tools I needed to win this fucked up game, which gave me the passion to persevere and claim ownership of the experience. It allowed me to play hard, bend rules, and look for an edge wherever and whenever I could until the horn sounded on Friday afternoon. To me, this was war, and the enemies were our instructors, who'd blatantly told us that they wanted to break us down and make us quit. Having their schedule in our heads would help us whittle the time down by memorizing what came next. And more than that, it would gift us a victory going in, which would give us something to latch onto during Hell Week when those motherfuckers were beating us down. Yo, man, I'm not playing, I said. We need that schedule. I could see Kenny Bigby, the only other black man in Class 231, raise an eyebrow from across the room. He'd been in my first Buds class and got injured just before Hell Week. Now he was back for seconds, too. Oh shit, he said. David Goggins is back on the log. Kenny smiled wide and I doubled over laughing. He'd been in the instructor's office, listening in when the doctors were trying to pull me out of my first Hell Week. It was during a log PT evolution. Our boat crews were carrying logs as a unit up and down the beach, soaked, salty, and sandy as shit. I was running with a log on my shoulders, vomiting blood. Bloody snot streamed from my nose and mouth, and the instructors periodically grabbed me and sat me down nearby because they thought I might drop fucking dead. But every time they turned around, I was back in the mix, back on that log. Kenny kept hearing the same refrain over the radio that night. "We need to get Goggins out of there," one voice said. "Roger that, sir. Goggins is sitting down." Another voice crackled. Then after a beat, Kenny would hear that radio chirp again. "Oh shit! Goggins is back on the log. I repeat, Goggins is back on the log." Kenny loved telling that story. At 5'10" and 170 pounds, he was smaller than I was, and wasn't on our boat crew, but I knew we could trust him. In fact, there was nobody better for the job. During Class 231, Kenny was tasked